Hello and welcome back to Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's Shakespeare Authorship Symposium. Coming to you live today, all day, from the August Family Vineyards here in Napa, California. We're so thrilled that you could join us from wherever you are in the country or the world. And with that, I'll say good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening if you happen to be on the dark side of the planet at this time while you're viewing. We're so glad that you can join us. We have a fantastic lineup set up for today of some of the best scholars and some of the latest research into Shakespeare authorship. And we're going to have a great day filled with wonderful information and compelling presentations. We hope that you have your notebooks ready to take your notes, to figure out what interests you, for you to then go further explore this greatest literary mystery of all time. We hope that you enjoyed last night's opening presentation. We had a wonderful presentation last night from Dr. Earl Showerman about Shakespeare and politics. And if you were not able to tune in for that last night, you'll be able to find that video on our YouTube channel with a lot of other of our YouTube videos from previous conference presentations. Many of you are aware that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has an annual conference every year, usually in a different American city. This year, of course, under today's conditions, we had to cancel that conference, but this symposium serves as a substitute for that. And the side benefit has been that there are hundreds of you who are able to tune in and join us today who otherwise would not have been able to travel to Ashland, Oregon, where the conference was supposed to be held. Our goal and our hope is that next fall we'll be back in Ashland, Oregon, having our regular conference and viewing some of the great presentations that occur at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. So let's keep our fingers crossed that that will be so. In the meantime, however, we have this fantastic lineup today of some of our wonderful scholars who will be here today and who will be sharing their research and information with you. Before we move into today's program, we would like to welcome back our president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, John Hamill, to share a few words with you this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be. John, welcome back to the symposium. So glad to have you here today, and so glad to be here with so many viewers all over the world.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you again. A great welcome to everybody. Again, here we're in Napa Valley, live, and we're going to talk about several things. First one's about the contest we have, not the contest, the raffle.
Yes, we have a raffle.
For donations, so you can buy a ticket for the raffle for $250, and the more each ticket is $250, the more tickets you buy, the better chance you have of winning the raffle. As you saw yesterday, Ben showed us the bus.
I'll grab it.
The bus that you will get. The bus that you will get for.
There it is, live on the screen. Look at that. Our wonderful producer has prepared a wonderful graphic and image for you to see. It is a beautiful bust that was commissioned by Ben August, whose home we're at right now, broadcasting live right from his living room. And it was created by an artist by the name of Paula Slater. And if you donate $250, you will be automatically entered to win this beautiful creation. For every $250 you donate, you get another entry into the raffle. Is that how it works, John?
That's correct. And the diagram you saw, you can see the quality of this much better in the photograph before, because here's kind of all white. But there we saw exactly how well crafted the statue of Oxford is.
And this way they have some context as to the size. You can see it's quite sizable, so it's a very beautiful piece. And we hope that you'll help us in trying to achieve our goal. And what is our goal for the weekend, John, as far as fundraising for the organization?
Thank you for bringing that up, because we were going to announce the winner of the raffle at like 3 p.m. today, but to extend the amount of time people have to donate, and to get more people able to donate, we're going to allow this to continue for one more week.
We're going to let it run all the way through today and into the week. And of course, we'll be putting that out there on all of our channels, our social media outlets, as well as an email blast to those of you who have subscribed to our email subscription. And if you haven't done that, you can go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. And you can enter in your email address, and we promise we won't spam you and send you a bunch of stuff you don't want. We only send out pertinent information with regards to the organization. We never share our lists with anyone. So if you haven't already joined our email subscriber list, please do that, and you'll get additional information about the raffle, as well as when the winner is announced. That announcement will go out as well.
Yeah. So again, when you sign up for this, your email is protected. We don't share that information with anybody else, so you're very protected in that. And then you can get into our website and do the donation. But I think we should make a date for this for.
Well, how about 1 week from today?
1 week from today?
That's
okay.
right.
Okay.
So we go off the air today. We're on the air all day today from now until 5 p.m. We will take a short break for lunch between noon and 1 p.m. so that everybody can get a little sustenance. But we'll be on the air through 5 o'clock today. So we'll extend the donation raffle through 5 p.m. next Saturday, which will be October 10th.
And then we hope to announce then the winner of the raffle by Sunday.
Sure.
And and that'll be announced on our website as to who won the raffle. So please.
You mean I can't just sneak him?
We're not qualified to win. Even though I'm donating $1,000 to this effort, I'm not going to buy 4 tickets. So don't worry about that. It's not going to come to me.
Board members and staff members are precluded from winning.
Yeah,
there we
correct. That way, you don't think it's already rigged beforehand. So anyway, so donate. We have until Saturday, next Saturday, 5 p.m. to donate. Okay, and which is a week from today, and then we'll announce the winner of the raffle. So buy your tickets, raffle tickets. It's only $250, and again, there you see the beautiful statue that Ben is donating for this effort. Thank you, Ben, for doing that. The other thing I want to talk about is which Joan Leon, she could not make it here today, but she's in charge. She's in charge of the committee that deals with finances and membership. So one thing she worked very hard on this is this planned giving, ensuring the future of the SOF. I don't know if you can see that or not. And there's a brochure that
They can find it on our website.
you can find on the website, and it's about bequests for the future, about how you can. We received several bequests already in the past. I think we have about $70,000 that we have received that way from bequests. So that's very important for our future. So you can do a bequest, you can do a POD account at your bank, charitable remainder. You can also leave in your will as to how much, percentage or amount you can leave in your will. Charitable gift annuity, you can do a gift, an annual gift if you want to. The IRA and retirement plan assets. You can also add us to your life insurance. There are many ways to do this that's convenient for you. There are many options how to do that. And again, this is a great way to ensure the future of the SOF. So any questions about that?
No, I think it's probably true to say that nobody likes to talk about dying. It's not a very favorite subject. However, if you would like to make an ever-living contribution to our ever-living poet and our organization, there are ways that you can speak to your estate planning attorney or CPA about ways that you can remember SOF in your planned giving, and we would love to have you do that for us so that into this generation and the next, we can continue this research and continue to share the truth about the real author known as Shakespeare.
And also, you don't have to wait till you die. You can do charitable donations and like an annual thing. You can set that up anyway, the explanation see how to do that. An annuity, you can do like an annual thing, gift. So anyway, so you don't have to wait so long to give us your bequest. You don't have to die to do that.
You don't have to be ever living.
Exactly.
Okay, well now let's get started with today's programming. Thank you, John. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
We have a great lineup for you today, and if you're curious about what that lineup is, you can also find that at the website, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. It should be right there at the bottom of your screen. You can go there to the symposium page, and you'll see what today's lineup is. We have a wonderful lineup for you, but to start it all off this morning, we're going to welcome a presentation by one of our leading scholars, James Warren, who is also the editor of the centennial edition of J. Thomas Looney's wonderful book, Shakespeare Identified in the Earl of Oxford. And if you haven't received a copy of that, then you can find that on Amazon, and you should go and get a copy of that. I know years ago when I tried to find a copy of the book, I had to get this weirdly printed version that is full of typos and crazy, odd formatting, because it was a reprint of a reprint of a reprint. And now, thanks to Jim's wonderful work, not only do we have this new, beautiful, and wonderfully edited centenary edition of the book, but also Jim is working on plenty of other research with regards to Looney's papers, his letters, his notes, his research, and he'll be sharing some of that with you in this presentation. So thank you for being here, and without further ado, let's welcome a presentation by James Warren.
Good morning, everyone, or maybe good afternoon. Since we're not able to meet in person this year, I'm grateful to the board and to Earl Showerman and others for making this remote gathering possible. My talk today is titled John Thomas Looney's Difficult Task. Mr. Looney's goal in writing Shakespeare Identified was to establish Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, as the real author of the literary works long believed to have been written by William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon. Now, if Shakespeare's works had been newly discovered with no author's name on them, it would have been a rather simple matter to convince others that Edward de Vere had written them. Looney's evidence matching the man with the works, linking Edward de Vere with Hamlet, All's Well That Ends Well, the sonnets, and so on, is so strong that just about everybody would have been convinced. But that was not the task that Looney faced. He had to convince people that works already attributed to William Shakespeare for more than 300 years had really been written by somebody else. That was a far harder task because it's much harder to break the hold of an existing belief and replace it with a new one than merely to introduce a new one. It was the pre-existing belief that was the problem, the factor that made Looney's task so difficult. He knew he faced an uphill battle, but he believed he was well prepared for it because of the extensive, multifaceted nature of the evidence he had accumulated and presented in Shakespeare Identified. And yet the battle was far harder than he expected. It was not easy for most of the first readers of Shakespeare Identified to accept Edward de Vere as Shakespeare. They were perplexed, unsure how seriously to take the idea. The attitude of many critics and reviewers was that although the evidence Looney presented seemed valid, there must be a flaw in it somewhere, even if they couldn't quite see what it was. Any idea that clashed so completely with what everybody already knew couldn't possibly be true, could it? There were, in fact, 3 levels of resistance that made it so difficult for so many to accept the Oxfordian answer to the Shakespeare mystery. The human resistance, the cognitive resistance, and the institutional resistance. 3 levels. So this talk could have been titled John Thomas Looney's Difficult Tasks, plural, not merely Looney's Difficult Task. The situation was actually much more complicated than this simple scenario of 3 levels suggests, but for the purpose of this rather short talk, a degree of simplification is necessary. Now, much of the information for this talk comes from a book I have been working on for several years, and that is nearing completion. So I'd like to tell you a bit about that book before examining the 3 levels of resistance. John Thomas Looney's Shakespeare Identified, the 100th anniversary of the book that is revolutionizing Shakespeare Studies, is the title. I don't have a cover yet, but here are mock-ups of 2 ideas for it. If this was a live presentation, I'd ask for your preferences between them. I'm now leaning toward the one on the right, the one with the lighter colored background. By the time this book is released next spring, I will have put 5 years into researching it and 1 year into writing it. So 6 years work will have gone into it. 6 years of my life. Most of the book focuses on the first 25 years of the Oxfordian era, 1920 to 1945. It's in 5 main parts with 18 chapters. Part 1 recounts John Thomas Looney's investigations into the authorship question and his presentation of his findings in Shakespeare Identified. It also presents the initial response to it by reviewers and critics and his replies to them. Much of my talk today will be drawn from Chapter 5, The Dozen Mental Revolutions from Part 1 of the book. Part 2 describes the rise of the Oxfordian movement, the founding of the Shakespeare Fellowship, and the activities and publications of Oxfordian scholars through the mid-1930s. Part 3 examines the Stratfordian response to the Oxfordian challenge. And Part 4 recounts the public battle between Oxfordians and Stratfordians as it played out in the public media in the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s. And in Part 5, I step back for some analysis. In Chapter 16, I examine why it matters who wrote Shakespeare's works. In 17, I compare the state of the Oxfordian movement today with that at the end of the 1930s, 80 years ago. And in the final chapter, I present lessons learned from the first generations of Oxfordians that might be useful for those of us today working to complete the Oxfordian revolution that Looney launched 100 years ago. Before returning to the three levels of resistance, let's review the two stories so that they are clearly in mind when we examine the resistance to the new one. In the traditional story, a young man from Stratford with no known education, someone who speaks a dialect of English not understood outside his native area, goes to London, where, through dint of his own native genius, he soon writes two lengthy poems in the most sophisticated London English, and then follows them up with plays showing intimate knowledge of politics, diplomacy, and courtly pursuits, and revealing great familiarity with the law in Italy, all without leaving behind a single trace of how he acquired any of that knowledge. He was uninvolved with the publication of his works, and at age 41 to 48, so the story goes, he abandoned his career to return to Stratford to engage in small-time commercial transactions for the rest of his life. In Mr. Looney's story, the author was one of the most highly educated people of his time, and as the highest-ranking earl in the kingdom, he was someone intimately involved with the Queen, the court, and the political and diplomatic events of his time. He had traveled extensively in Italy and France and had written works acclaimed by his contemporaries as the best by courtly poets and dramatists. He was deeply involved with the publication of Shakespeare's works, which ceased in 1604, the year of his death. The result of these two stories are, on one hand, literary works that are, in effect, floating freely in space with no connection to the life of the man who supposedly wrote them or to his times. And on the other hand, literary works that are deeply personal portrayals of events and people important in the life of Edward de Vere and of the political and diplomatic events of his times. On the one hand, the works are the products of fantasy and genius, and on the other, they are the products of concrete realities, imaginatively recreated by genius. On the one hand, we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who spoke for many in saying that he could not marry Shakespeare's life to his verse. And on the other hand, Canon Gerald H. Rendell, one of the founders of the University of Liverpool, who observed that the plays reveal numerous and arresting coincidences with recorded events and traits in the career of Edward de Vere. Okay, back to the three levels of resistance. The first level of resistance, the human resistance, is common to all people. It's simply the natural human resistance to changing any long-held belief. It's easier to go straight ahead than to turn, and especially to do a U-turn. Walter Bagehot, the prominent British economist and critic, someone Looney quoted in Shakespeare Identified, realized that unbelief far oftener needs a reason and requires an effort than belief. The human mind, he recognized, does not treat new ideas neutrally. Most people's first impulse is to reject new ideas that contradict beliefs already held. It's also from Bagehot that we have the phrase, the cake of custom, that he used when applying that first insight about individuals to society as a whole. After surveying the development of human societies over all of recorded history, Bagehot concluded that the great difficulty which history records is not that of the first step, but of the second step. What is most evident is not the difficulty of getting a fixed law, but of getting out of a fixed law, not of cementing a cake of custom, but of breaking the cake of custom. So the first level of resistance to the Oxfordian idea incorporates both individual and social aspects of human psychology. The second level is cognitive resistance. This type of resistance arises from the need to change the specific beliefs involved in the subject of Shakespearean authorship. There are two parts to it. One arises from the complexities of the Oxfordian claim itself, and the other from the consequences that flow from that claim. The weight of the combination of the two, of the complexities and the consequences, is so heavy that it's hard for the human mind to process it all, at least within a short span of time. The mind wants to shut down when faced with such difficulties. It's unable to move forward, just like in the image, the weight of the cart is so heavy that the donkey cannot move forward. For the donkey, many trips carrying smaller loads will be necessary, and that takes time. For most people, dipping into the Oxfordian claim many times will be necessary to absorb it and the consequences that flow from it, and that too takes time. Looney knew that acceptance of the Oxfordian thesis would not be easy or instantaneous. He commented on several occasions that readers would need to make an effort to understand it. Everything depends, he wrote, on the willingness of the reader to familiarize himself with all the particulars and by a mental effort of his own to bring them together so as to judge their total weight as evidence. This requires time and an open mind. And then there are the hidden consequences of the Oxfordian claim. That is, consequences that for most first-time readers of Shakespeare identified were not immediately apparent. The more they thought through the Oxfordian claim, though, the more complicated it became. They began to see that it was not a matter of simply plucking one man out and putting another in his place. Making the change in that one overarching belief in who the author was leads logically and inevitably to overthrowing another dozen major beliefs, and these in turn lead to changes in more than 50 other subsidiary beliefs. These beliefs all hang together as a coherent package. You can't choose which ones to change. It's all or nothing at all. It's like the old advertisement for Lay's potato chips. You can't eat just one. The cognitive resistance, the shutting down of the brain, comes when the number of beliefs to be changed suddenly seems overwhelming. Considering them all en masse is more than the mind can handle, at least in a short period of time. So it's much simpler to back up and reject the change in that one overarching belief than it would be to have to engage in the mental effort to change 12 other big beliefs and 50 subsidiary beliefs. The dozen major beliefs that have to be changed if one accepts the change in author are each so substantial that I call them mental revolutions. Here's a quick look at the dozen mental revolutions and the 50 subsidiary beliefs that flow from them that all must be changed. The font here might be too small to read, but the purpose of this slide is just to give you a sense of the number of beliefs to be changed flowing from that one initial change in author. So it's no wonder so many people balked at accepting the Oxfordian claim upon their first hearing of it. Let's look at some examples of the mental revolutions and the subsidiary beliefs that have to be changed. Mental revolution number 2 concerns the external conditions in which Shakespeare's plays were written. 2 of the subsidiary beliefs concern the venues for which they were written and when. In the old Stratfordian view, as expressed by Sir Sidney Lee, the plays were written for the public theaters. In the new Oxfordian view, the plays were written for performances in the court and in private theaters. Only later were they performed in public theaters. In the Oxfordian view, the plays were written roughly 15 years earlier than in the Stratfordian. Mental revolution number 4 concerns chains of influence on Shakespeare, and one of the subsidiary beliefs concerns the influence on Shakespeare of the dramatist John Lyly. But if Shakespeare's plays had been written 15 years earlier than had been supposed, then the order of the chain of influence must be reversed. In the Stratfordian view, as expressed by Sir Sidney Lee, Shakespeare profited by the lessons which these men were teaching. Lily in comedy and Marlowe in tragedy may be reckoned the masters to whom he stood in the relation of disciple on the threshold of his career. In the Oxfordian view, as expressed by Mr. Looney, the dramas of Edward de Vere form the source from which sprang Lilly's dramatic conceptions and enterprises. Lilly and his work constitute a most important link in the chain of evidence connecting the work of Shakespeare with the Earl of Oxford. Only under the influence of the Stratfordian theory, cause is mistaken for effect. Here's one of the subsidiary views regarding the internal aspects of the plays. In the old view, as again expressed by Sir Sidney Lee, it is dangerous to read into Shakespeare's dramatic utterances allusions to his personal experience. An unquestioned characteristic of Shakespeare's art is its impersonality. In the new Oxfordian view, the plays and poems are intensely personal and topical. As Mr. Looney wrote, Shakespeare's work is much more a record of his own personal relationships than has hitherto been supposed. Shakespeare's characters are taken from his own experience of the men and women about him, actually living men and women, artistically modified and adjusted to fit them for the part they had to perform, are what we may be sure the plays contain. Continuing in the same vein, in the older view, Sir Edmund Chambers, perhaps the most respected traditional scholar of William Shakespeare and of the Elizabethan stage, agreed with Sir Sidney Lee that the plays were not topical. He believed that Shakespeare does not seem to have been greatly given to topical illusions, and the hunt for them is dangerous. Well, isn't it interesting that both Sir Sidney Lee and Sir Edmund Chambers used the word dangerous when referring to topical illusions? Perhaps because it was dangerous for their blind belief in the man from Stratford. The Oxfordian view is that the plays were intensely topical. One study identified 433 topical allusions in Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet, with 50, heads the list. Of the 50 topical allusions in Hamlet just noted, 44 tie the play to the early 1580s, rather than the later 1590s. These include allusions to preparations for the expected Spanish invasion, to activities such as casting cannons, shipbuilding, and so on, needed for defense against the Spanish Armada. And then there is the allusion to magnetism. When Gertrude tells Hamlet, "Sit here," and he replies, "No, mother, here is metal more attractive," and then sits down next to Ophelia, the author is making a topical reference to a book on magnetism just published, and that was the subject of discussion in court circles in the early 1580s. The larger point here, though, is not that the literary works contain references to contemporary events and people, but that the connections work both ways. Yes, we can understand the plays better by knowing Elizabethan history at the time the plays were actually written, now that we know the correct dates. But perhaps even more important, scholars can learn much about the historical foreground, about the Elizabethan era at the time the plays were originally written, once it is fully recognized just how extensively they commented on contemporaneous events. They really were the abstracts and brief chronicles of their times. Mental Revolutions 8 and 9 relate to the nature of genius and literary creativity. The Stratfordian view is that genius was like a magic wand. It can explain anything. As Sir Sidney Lee stated, the infinite difference between Shakespeare's endeavors and those of his fellows was due to the magical and involuntary workings of genius. The Oxfordian view brings the understanding of genius and literary creativity back into line with psychologists' usual understanding of them. As Looney explained, there is a frequent assumption that the possession of what we call genius renders its owner capable of doing almost anything. Now, William Shakespeare is the one and only stock illustration of this contention. In all other cases, where the whole of the circumstances are well known, we may connect the achievements of a genius with what may be called the external accidents of his life. Though social environment is not the source of genius, it certainly has always determined the forms in which the faculty has clothed itself. A vast disparity or incompatibility between the man and the work must always justify a measure of doubt as to the genuineness of his pretensions and make us cast about for a more likely agent. Mental revolution number 11 concerns Edward de Vere and his place in the times in which he lived. Accepting Oxford as Shakespeare gives us a fuller understanding of the man who wrote Shakespeare's plays. Like with the two-way relationship between the allusions in the plays and the history of the times, information about the author's life helps us understand the plays better, and allusions in the plays help us understand Oxford's life, his experiences, and his personality more deeply. We see that he was not merely a courtier with poetic tendencies, as Sir Sidney Lee would have it, but someone who stood at the heart of the intellectual and literary and artistic life of the Elizabethan age. As Gerald Rendell wrote in a passage worth emphasizing, only lately has it become plain how central a place belongs to Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, at the confluence of the various currents of literary activity, poetic, dramatic, exotic, and academic, which combine to form the product known as Elizabethan. Student, poet, playwright, and patron of the drama, he was in touch with the most versatile spirits of the age, and in the judgment of his best informed contemporaries, his own compositions were second to none in excellence. So, Oxford was at the center of it all, connected to the Renaissance flowing in from Italy and France, where he had lived for more than a year, and at the forefront of the literary and linguistic revolutions taking place from the 1570s onwards. His is a truly fascinating story about one of the most important and most interesting human beings who ever lived, and we would not know much about it if not for John Thomas Looney. I hope this quick look at a few of the mental revolutions that had to be gone through, and at some of the subsidiary beliefs that had to be changed for anyone to fully buy into the Oxfordian claim, gives you some sense of just how overwhelming the number of changes was for someone encountering the Oxfordian thesis for the first time. And I hope it gives you a sense of the difference the change in author makes. Those that persevered in their efforts to understand it came away with deeper understandings of many subjects, including Shakespeare's plays and poems, the Elizabethan era, the nature of genius and literary creativity, and the nature of the true author and the central place he held in the times in which he lived. These subjects have been greatly misunderstood for over 400 years because Shakespeare has been misidentified. And now we turn to the third of the three levels of resistance, the institutional resistance. Departments of literature within universities are not merely the places in which literary scholars work, they were institutions with institutional interests to be protected and resources that could be used to protect them. The leaders of those departments at the time considered Shakespeare identified and the Oxfordian claim to be threats to the status and interests of their institutions, and they used the full range of their powers to try to neutralize that threat. As one tactic, they ignored the Oxfordian challenge whenever possible. In the course of writing my book, I examined the works of the top 48 Shakespeare scholars of the 1920s and 1930s and found that 2/3 of them made no reference whatsoever to John Thomas Looney, Shakespeare identified, or the Oxfordian claim. The remaining third mentioned the Oxfordian idea in passing before airily dismissing it as not worthy of serious attention. When scholars were forced to address the Oxfordian thesis, they continued to repeat old charges that Oxfordians had already rebutted without any mention of those rebuttals. They changed the subject. They presented distorted versions of the Oxfordian claim and then showed the ridiculousness of the distorted versions they had presented. And they rejected the methodology of citing personal and topical allusions in the plays to Edward de Vere's life and personality and to other events and people important to him. The one thing that academia did not do was subject the Oxfordian claim to the sort of objective scholarly examination to which literary scholars subjected all other literary matters. Or if they did, the results were never made public. I examined this subject of academia's response to the Oxfordian challenge in great detail in my book, devoting 3 chapters and more than 100 pages to it. And now to sum up, John Thomas Looney correctly identified Edward de Vere as the author of the works known as Shakespeare's. Over the first quarter century of the Oxfordian era, he and other Oxfordian scholars made great progress in convincing many people of de Vere's authorship. That is, they made great progress in overcoming the human resistance and the cognitive resistance to the idea of Edward de Vere's authorship. But they were not able to overcome the institutional resistance. The forces and resources arrayed against them within academia were too strong to be overcome before the Second World War shut down their efforts in 1939 in England. By the time the war ended, 6 years later, in the second half of 1945, most of the most prominent members of the Oxfordian movement in England had died or withdrawn from active involvement in it because of old age. The situation was the same in the United States by the end of 1948. And so it remains up to us, to those of us active in the Oxfordian movement today, to continue the effort to complete the Oxfordian revolution that John Thomas Looney launched 100 years ago. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody again, alive and well, at the conference next year.
And thank you, Jim Warren, for that fascinating presentation. We're so glad that you could join us for that, and here we are back live from Napa, California. Before we bring on our next presenter, well, I want to remind you that part of today's presentation, we're going to be announcing the winners of our annual Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest. The Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest is now in its 4th year, and each year we are more and more surprised by not only the number of entries we receive, but the quality of entries we receive. And over the years, we've received some magnificent entries, some wonderful finalists, and some fantastic winners. This year is no exception, and later today, we'll show you those winners and announce them: 3rd place, 2nd place, and 1st place. But before we get into that, and before we get into our next presenter, here's a finalist from a previous year that's a favorite of mine.
With unfettered access to one of England's most extensive libraries, he had the finest tutors and received degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. He wrote poetry, sonnets, and dramatic plays. He traveled extensively in France and Italy, discovering the Renaissance in full bloom. He became a favorite at court, heading up acting companies and performing plays for the Queen. He was deemed best of the courtier poets and was a generous patron of young writers. More works were dedicated to him than to any other figure save the Queen herself. This man was Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford and Lord Great Chamberlain of England. Queen Elizabeth granted him an enormous annuity of £1,000 per year for secret work, and King James referred to him as Great Oxford. He underscored multiple passages in his Geneva Bible that later showed up in Shakespeare, and the plays themselves contain numerous allusions to events in his own life. At a pivotal point, nearing the height of his literary powers, this great man mysteriously chose to go dark and wrote no more as the celebrated nobleman. And then, just as mysteriously, a new writer appeared on the scene, starting off with an accomplished poem and ending with some of the most sublime literature the world has ever known.
Well, there you have it. That's one of our previous year finalists and one of my favorite videos from the past. We'll be out the day in between some of our presenters as we lead up to the great announcement of this year's winners. We also want to remind you that we will be announcing this year's Oxfordian of the Year later on this afternoon, so please stay tuned. As we move forward into the program, our next speaker is Marc-Andre Alexander, and he's going to present to you a presentation about Stratfordian blind spots. So stay tuned. In just a couple of seconds, here comes Mark.
Hi, I want to thank the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship for inviting me to present, especially as a celebration of the life of Tom Renier, who passed earlier this year. I think we all agree Tom was one of the nicest and smartest people we've ever met, and he will be missed. What I'm doing today is a part of my professional life, and I normally present to engineering managers in Silicon Valley from Asia, Europe, and North America. And here's the semiconductor industry. Oops, let me turn this on. The semiconductor industry is an unusual one. It's high tech, but it's different. High tech is already very fast. Semiconductor is even faster. What you see here, the big building, is a Samsung fab in Korea. Costs over $7 billion. And it's something that's just, it's an amazing thing. In semiconductor, we make the machines that take the silicon wafers that make the chips for your iPhone and other things. And process engineers are people who have to innovate and think differently out of the box. So that's the area I worked in. And one of the things I did is I helped newly promoted and newly hired engineering managers in the area of high performance thinking and innovation, how the mind works, how it creates blind spots to the truth, how to overcome limitations, how to think in ways nobody else has thought of before. And so what I'm going to present today has some scholarly research behind it, especially my master's project on this topic, conscious use of the adaptive unconscious to enhance self-efficacy and change adaptability. What that simply means is having a strong sense that you can make things happen, you can set stretch goals, and you can achieve things, and also adapt in a changing environment. It's such a crazy atmosphere that engineers and others in this environment have to learn how to walk moving ice flows. It's crazy. The last book on this list, Strangers to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious, is a key book to understand some of the stuff I'm going to do today. Everything is in a book of mine called Creating Your Life. If you like what you hear today, you can go pretty deep into this. I'm going to cover about 15% of what I cover for engineering managers. It's a topic that I love and I'm excited about, so I'm going to end up talking very quick. So I'm glad this is being recorded because you may want to go back to it. What we're going to explore together today is rocks in your head. Are there things in your head that are getting in your way of seeing the truth, of seeing things differently and innovating? We're also going to talk about something called the reticular activating system. This is a network of cells in your head that its purpose is to create blind spots. We're also going to talk about the subconscious mind and the adaptive unconscious. We're talking about different parts of the mind. It's actually one thing. It's kind of all baked together, but I'm going to artificially separate the pieces and walk you through it and show how this relates to authorship questions, orthodox scholars, and how they respond to the kind of things we present. So here are some propositions. Your mind holds blind spots to the truth. You don't act according to the truth, but according to the truth you believe is absolute and certain. Your mind has the ability, quite literally, to keep you blind to evidence that stares you in the face. Your mind powerfully protects your self-image, your identity, from anything that threatens it, especially the truth. Certain behaviors can reveal to you that you have blind spots. And I discovered this early in my research. I published an article almost 20 years ago now, Shakespeare's Knowledge of Law, Journey Through the History of the Arguments. When I was studying and reading an English barrister named Sir George Greenwood. And Sir George wrote a book called The Shakespeare Problem Restated, in which he didn't know who wrote the plays, but he did question the current attribution and was marshaling the evidence. And he did it like a lawyer. And he made it's an incredible book, has lots of good arguments, and it's something that begs to be answered. One person who answered that was J.M. Robertson in his book, The Baconian Heresy. Even though Greenwood wasn't necessarily a Baconian, Robertson put in that context. And reading him and reading his responses, you begin to realize that Greenwood is a hard person to answer. In fact, all the way up into the 60s and even to the present day, George W. Keaton, who's also a lawyer, wrote a book, and it's the same kind of thing. They have a hard time dealing with what Greenwood actually says. In fact, what's interesting about Keaton is when he's not thinking of authorship, he has incredible things to say about Shakespeare's knowledge of law and politics and other things. But as soon as he thinks authorship, then he changes on a dime and starts undercutting his own arguments. It's a fascinating thing, and it was a fascination for me, especially given the professional work I do. And so one of the things about Shakespeare scholars, people who set themselves up as experts, there's something here to question, and I want to tell you a story about Cliff Young. This happened back in the 80s in Australia. Every year in Australia, they have a marathon from Sydney to Melbourne, and it's about a 600-kilometer marathon, so it goes on for days. In those days, I think it was like 6-7 days long. And you know what marathoners look like, the professional ones, how they're dressed up in nice suits, and they have coaches, and they do everything. Well, one day, this guy in his 60s, Cliff Young, shows up in Oshkosh overalls and galoshes. And they kind of look at him because he looked like a derelict, that he had stumbled into the wrong place. And they asked him why he was here. And he says, well, I'm here to run the marathon. And, you know, really, have you trained? And he says, well, I have a station, a farm. I have some sheep. I have some cattle. I don't have a horse, but I run around, you know, to get them moved. This is how I train. And they said, well, all right, good luck, old man. And so the marathon started. And Cliff Young, he had just kind of a slow, shuffling gait, nothing unusual. Now, the professional marathoners worked with experts, and the experts told them to do a marathon that goes for 6 or 7 days. You have to run 18 hours and sleep 6, more or less. Run 18 hours, sleep 6. This is how you optimize the ability to run and complete such a marathon. Well, Cliff did not have experts teaching him, and not only did he win the race, he cut a day and a half off the record time. And you can go read articles about it. He was a sensation in Australia. What happened was Cliff just knew he was supposed to run, so he just kept shuffling along at this slow pace while all the expert-trained marathoners were sleeping. Occasionally he'd catch an hour nap, and then he'd get up and just keep going again. And this tells you something about experts. And this is kind of, you know, in the words of Richard Feynman, the great inventor of quantum chromodynamics and one of the finest lecturers at Caltech, and I strongly urge anyone to go to YouTube and watch his videos. He says, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Now, this came up just a few weeks ago in a Don't Quill the Messenger podcast when Stephen was interviewing Dr. Roger Strittmatter, who talked about the cult of experts, how they can have this kind of insular view of things. He also talked about the Stratfordian Trust and believed that They believe that we are threatening their livelihood, and they're right, we are. But we're threatening more than their livelihood, we're threatening their fundamental identity. And I want to kind of clue you into how that process works and why it's important to understand, especially for Oxfordian scholars. And by the way, Feynman was the scientist that was with NASA experts when the Challenger disaster occurred. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. And on YouTube, you can find a video where Feynman is with the NASA experts, and they're talking about O-rings, and the NASA experts are saying, well, the low temperature at launch had really nothing to do with it. This little O-ring, which kept certain chemicals from mixing, which would cause the explosion. They didn't think it failed. So during a break, Feynman, who's a very practical scientist, but also an engineer, and didn't believe experts, he had a glass of ice water, dropped the O-ring in, brought it out, squeezed it, and it lost all of its resiliency. So he comes back in, and you can see this on YouTube, and just tells people what he did. He just demonstrated in a moment that the O-rings would fail if the temperature is freezing. So think about that. Anybody who talks about experts, relying on experts, or they talk about consensus of experts, we're not talking science. Okay, we're going to talk about blind spots to the truth. This is, some of you may have seen this in a psychology class. If you look inside that, read what's in the triangle for a second. And, most people read that and they see Paris in the spring. That's not what it says. Look again. If you're seeing Paris in the spring, I'm telling you, that's not what you're seeing. If you look closely, it actually says Paris in the spring. Okay, here's another one. And this is a short little video. Let's see, I'm going to run it really quickly here. There's no audio, so it's not a big deal. And some of you may have seen this before, but even if you did, whoops, let me go back. Can we go back one? Oh, I have the control, yes. There we go. Let me try again. Let me see if I can hit that. There we go. This is called the monkey business illusion. So essentially, you're going to see some players wearing white and black uniforms. They're going to pass the ball, and you're going to count the number of times the players in white pass the ball. Okay. So yeah, there were 16 passes, and half the people who see this did not spot the gorilla. Okay? And if you've seen this before, and some people have, all right, did you notice that the curtain changed color? And when the gorilla entered, a black player left. This is what happens when you focus. And by the way, this is what magicians know, and this is what misdirection is all about. Now watch this again. You're focused on the players. Here comes a gorilla in the middle of your screen, and you do not see it. Okay? It's an amazing thing to see. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go on from there. Boop, boop, boop. And I have one more. Read this sentence to yourself, and just for a minute, read it one time to yourself. Okay, read it again and count the letters F. Count the number of F's in that sentence. Okay. If you're like most people, you'll see 2 or 3 F's, okay? These are the F's that everybody sees in finished files and scientific. Now, if you are with somebody, don't give them the answer. There are 7 F's in that sentence, and if you only see 3 F's, I'm telling you there are 7, and you're not even seeing it, even though I'm telling you that, okay? There are 7 F's in that. Can you find them? Would you be amazed to think that I'm telling you what's in front of your eyes and you still can't see it? Look at the 4 ofs. There are 7 F's in that sentence. When I do this with engineering managers, by this time I have them. If you're in HR or learning and development, you got about 10 minutes in front of an engineering audience to get their attention, otherwise they're gone. They don't care what you have to say. In the first 10 minutes of these presentations, I get inside their head and talk about a mechanism inside their head that I know exists that they don't, and I have them for the rest of the week. So this brings up a few questions. How are blind spots created? Do I have blind spots that limit or control me, my imagination, or my scholarly work? How can I discover and overcome my blind spots? How can I avoid creating blind spots? How can I recognize blind spots in other people? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. First, I want to introduce you to the reticular activating system. This is a network of cells in the middle of your brain. Now, I'm using some synecdoche here. It's a rhetorical term about a part for the whole reticular activating system. There's more stuff involved, but this keeps it simple. The reticular activating system works with sensory input, what you see, hear, and feel. At any given moment, you have 11 million pieces of input sensory data, and if your conscious mind had to deal with it, it would drive you nuts, okay? So the reticular activating system, its job, it controls sleeping, waking, and your attention, your consciousness, where your focus is. It works as a sophisticated filter, and its job is to create blind spots to the junk in your sensory life. So it acts like an executive secretary to the CEO, okay, who knows what's important to the CEO and only lets those communications come through or those appointments take place that matter to the CEO. Your brain, your conscious mind is the CEO. It allows you to focus on what you value. It also allows you to perceive a threat. So anything you value or see as a threat gets through. So if I'm reading a book, if I'm into a good novel, everything sensorily around me is irrelevant. I'm in that world of books. So slowly it'll start cutting out anything. I won't hear things happen, okay? If somebody calls me to dinner, I'm not going to hear it. Sometimes if they call my name, that might get through. But since I'm not valuing anything but the book I'm reading, I'm lost in that world. And this is what this reticular activating system does, okay? This is also important. This is what new mothers discover. A new mother can sleep through the airplane going overhead, the truck going by, the alarm going off, but the moment that baby whimpers, wakes right up. That's important. It gets through. If you have a neighbor's dog that barks all night, it's keeping you up. That's because you hear it as a threat. How can the neighbor sleep through it? Well, the neighbor can sleep through because they don't see it as a threat. It's okay for them. I'm going to skip this and go right to the next part. It also supports you when you set goals, especially if you set goals that you don't know how to achieve. Like, how do I make an iPhone touch where I can just like scroll through things with my finger? We don't know how to do that. Well, you got to invent the way. So you set the goal. The reticular activating system sees that it's valued, and that gets through. What you value gets through. Let me give you an example of something. When you think about it, like when you're reading a book, begin, go to sleep, focus on work, this thing will kick in. You have to decide who or what do you value, who or what do you not value. And what happens when you do not respect a differing opinion of a colleague, even an orthodox Shakespearean scholar? Let me tell you about the CIA and the reticular activating system, and this relates directly to the founding of the Oxfordian movement. Herbert Meyer worked for the CIA under Ronald Reagan, and he said there's a special talent needed to avoid intelligence failures, the ability to spot a pattern with the fewest possible facts. Now, at that time, CIA analysts were telling the president that the Soviet Union economy was growing at 3%. It's a good, like ours, it's a growing economy. But Reagan, Casey, the head of the CIA, and Meyer, they did not believe it, that there was something wrong, and they wanted proof of it. So they went to the senior CIA guys. They had no interest in the question, but the younger guys were willing to look. So the question to them is, what would we look for if the Soviet economy was going to collapse? What would be valuable information to have? So they made a highly technical list of what our spies should look for. Sent it to our spies, our allies, And they set that goal, which opened up the reticular activating system so that people could see what was valued. And it changed their perceptions of things. One of the things, some data came in, but I'll give you just one example. A Moscow train carrying meat to distant manufacturing city was robbed by workers, but the army was told to back off, catching and punishing the workers. Meat shortages were everywhere. They were being realized, and they started accumulating this evidence. The spies were asked, why wasn't this reported before? Well, we didn't know you were looking for it. It didn't fit into anything. And because you asked the question, now we can see the data and send it on as valuable. So, first rule of intelligence, know what you're looking for. And J. Thomas Loney did this, okay? This looks familiar. Soviet Union economy is strong. Assume it's not. Make a list of what indicates a weak economy. Go look for evidence. Examine the new evidence and make sense of the data. Conclusion, Soviet economy is going to collapse. Well, Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays. Well, did he? Assume someone else wrote it. Make a list of the unknown writer's characteristics. Go look for evidence. Examine the new evidence and make sense of the data. Looney, Edward de Vere wrote the plays. Okay, I'm going fast because I'm excited, and I'm only covering 15% of the material I cover for engineers, but I'm still going to get through a lot. Let's talk about the conscious mind and the subconscious repository. By the way, we all know we have a subconscious mind. How many of you take it into account in your daily life? Hopefully after today, you may take it into account more. This is what happens when we consciously deal with with the world. We perceive something and we connect it to our experience. Here's the thing running toward me. It's a Rottweiler. Oh yeah, I had an experience with a Rottweiler before. It wasn't good. I don't want to be here when it arrives, so I'm out of here, okay? Consciously, that's what we do. In the beginning, maybe consciously, when you were learning how to drive, everything was freaking you out because you had to press the gas, you had to hit the brake, you had to look around for things. Consciously, that was a challenge in the beginning. Over time, it wasn't a challenge. Why not? Well, because of the subconscious repository. The subconscious repository is a machine. It automatically stores repeated patterns, habits, and preferences. Whatever you do over and over again gets stored in your subconscious mind and is made automatic. So if I learn how to type, I can consciously type up to 20 words a minute by knowing what keys to go, but at a certain point, I have to repeat enough so my subconscious takes over, it co-opts it, and suddenly I can go even faster because I'm not thinking about everything I'm typing. It gets stored. Same with habits, like smoking. If I smoke enough, pretty soon I'm into the habit of the smoking. Preferences, I like broccoli, I don't like cauliflower, whatever it is. If I say it long enough, it gets stored and made automatic. This also happens to our self-image. Whatever you say about yourself, I'm this kind of person, I'm that kind of person, I have these preferences, I am this, I am that. That also gets stored and is made automatic. If in second grade I take some kind of standardized test and it says, oh, Mark, yeah, the test shows that you're weak in math. Well, we're going to put you on a creative writing track. So I'm weak in math. Thanks for letting me know. I might have tried. And I can store that as a self-image, especially from an authority who gives it to me. And the thing is, and this is what the research shows, and it's amazing, there's a part of our mind that later on, if I do well on a math test, will I say, hey, I'm good at math? No, I will say it's a fluke, it's an accident, it's not like me, I'm weak in math. And there's a part of your mind that will automatically adjust to reality so that the next time you take a math test, it will require you to answer some questions wrong to fit the picture that you got stored. Same is true of reality, how you observe the world, people, the environment, the meaning of life, whatever it is, that gets stored as well. It's a very powerful thing. Patterns get stored, what you repeat gets stored. So what is it that you say about yourself over and over again? Oh, I'm not good at remembering names. Oh, I'm not good at remembering names. Your subconscious takes note and stores it and will make sure that you're not good at remembering names. So, are there rocks in your head? What prevents you from seeing or behaving differently? Your abilities, your achievements, your attitudes, habits, self-image, past, future, view of other Oxfordians, view of Orthodox Shakespearean scholars. Do you have rocks in your head that are preventing you from seeing truth because they've been stored automatically in your subconscious? How does that work specifically? The adaptive unconscious. It has a very particular job. Most things get stored consciously because we don't want to have to deal with remembering how to open a door and walk through it, so it gets stored. So instead, we have this thing called the adaptive unconscious that operates actively between the conscious mind and the subconscious repository. Its job is to match pictures. If I have this stored picture of myself, I'm weak at math. But in the outside conscious world, something happens that shows me something that contradicts. And there's a difference in picture, what's stored and what's happening. Some people would call it cognitive dissonance, but it's more than that. Its job is to make sure the picture matches. And if I don't somehow convince myself that maybe I can be good at math, then my behavior, my performance in the world adjusts to match the picture and prove to me again on a bad math test I take later that, yeah, I'm weak in math. That's its job. It's a spin doctor. It also maintains truth. What you believe is true. It doesn't matter what the truth is. What do you believe the truth is? Especially if you're emotionally convinced that this is true about me, this is true about reality, this is true about those people. Oh, you know how the French are, you know how the Germans are. What about the South Koreans? If you have some kind of truth about any cultural group or any group of people, it can get in your way of dealing with individuals. It has a strong bias towards making us feel good. Its job is to make sure the pictures match. So the question is, what do you have stored that you don't even know is there? What was told to you by professors, by people you respect that got stored, what do you say to yourself over and over again? What is the words you're saying to yourself in your head? What is your self-talk? It also creates motivation because, okay, right now I'm not an engineer, but I could be an engineer. So if I can see a picture of me being an engineer, if I hold on to that picture and act like it's a stored picture of me, the adaptive unconscious creates motivation for me to go to school, do the work, and get the degree so that the picture will match. In other words, it will help you adapt the other way as well. Okay? What time is it? Ooh, I'm going fast. Okay, I'll slow down just a little bit and tell you some stories. Once I was called up. I'm a piano player, and I played on stage. I participated in some recordings. Once I was called up for a seminar that was 6 months away in another city, and I was asked to get a choir together and come and conduct a choir. I had never conducted a choir in my life, and I said, sure, I'll do it. Because I'm the kind of person that knows, I know about the reticular activating system, I know about the adaptive unconscious. I also know I just had barely enough that they wouldn't have asked me unless they saw something in me that said, maybe you can do this. So I immediately got on the phone with some people, hey, I'm going to conduct a choir, do you want to sing in it? People I knew who could perform. I started putting it together, but there was still a problem. I didn't know how to conduct a choir. I remember being in a used bookstore in Sacramento, California, and I was going to the science fiction section to buy a novel or something. I happened to pass through the music section, and something caught my eye, and it's like, wait, what? And I looked down, and it was a book on the bottom shelf, How to Conduct a Choir. Now, in any other world, I would never have seen that book, but because my reticular activating system was open, because I was goal-oriented, anything that will support me gets through. By the way, this is how networking works. If you want to have somebody, if you have a goal, let other people know your goal. And if they have that, it'll get through them and they'll send it to you, especially if they value your friendship. So I also asked people, hey, I read that book, that helped a lot. Do you know anybody that's conducted a choir? Well, somebody said, well, we know this person, they were a vocal coach once, they were in a choir. So I got that person in the choir and she helped teach me to do it. And 6 months later, we performed 3 pieces of music, it went great. And I became officially a choir conductor and immediately resigned. But the thing is, I knew enough at that time, and this is one of the things I help other people understand, is you set goals that you don't know how to achieve. For example, I put myself through college working at a 7-Eleven store, and being a piano player and having no money, I wanted a piano in my house. But I couldn't buy one, I couldn't rent one. So what did I do? I said, okay, I'm setting the goal. I'm gonna have a piano in my house. I don't know how yet, but I set the goal. And then it occurred to me, there are people that have pianos, they never use them, and they may be in the way. They may not want to give them away, but they might let me want to store it. In fact, I bet you there are people with 2 pianos, and that's just one too many. So they wouldn't be out of piano. I bet they would be able to let me move one into my house and keep it and store it for them. So I started asking every customer at this 7-Eleven store, you wouldn't happen to have an extra piano that you wouldn't mind me storing for you because I'm a piano player? It only took 2 weeks. This one gentleman, regular customer, looked at me and he said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do have a piano. I don't want to get rid of it, but my wife doesn't want it in the house, so I think it'd be great. So I got a friend's truck. We went over there. He had this beautiful spinet piano from the 1920s. It was a tabletop piano. Then he had this big black upright Baldwin piano. And I'm looking at the Baldwin. How am I going to get that in this little truck? And he said, no, you get to take the spinet piano. And really, okay. So we got it in. I had it for 4.5 years. It was amazing before he wanted it back. When I moved in with my wife in the Bay Area, I didn't have a piano. Well, I want a piano. Somebody allowed me to move one in for 15 years. When we moved a few years ago up to the Sierra foothills, I didn't have a piano, and we were in a big house, and I'm looking and I'm saying, gosh, there's enough room here for a grand piano. I haven't even gotten to the point of asking people. Within a month, somebody texted me and says, hey, I can't think of a better person to give my mom's grand piano to. Do you want it? So one of the things that you learn is that you set goals that you have no idea how to achieve, and you start bypassing some of the blind spots that can happen in your head. So, a little review on the adaptive unconscious. It's like the autopilot on a boat. Think of it this way. Okay, you're on a lake and you're fishing, and you set the autopilot to very slowly go north. Okay, and nothing's happening. So you decide, oh, okay, I want to go east instead. So you go up to the wheel and you turn the boat and you start heading east. This is what willpower is, by the way. Use willpower to override the system. Then you let go and go back to fishing. What happens? Well, you start going back north again, okay? Because you have this image, you have something programmed in, and the adaptive conscious, its job is to make sure you're going with what's stored. So the question is, what's inside of you that's overriding your willpower? For example, I smoked cigarettes for 8 years, 2 packs a day. I love smoking. But there was a point, obviously, this is not a healthy thing to do. And of course, I quit. I overrode the system. But the moment I still craved a cigarette, and I even continued smoking if I smoked 1 cigarette. So what did I do? At a certain point, I realized, oh, I have to go in and change what's stored. So my goal was to be a non-smoker. Okay, I'm a non-smoker. And I started acting like a non-smoker. I imagined that there was no smoke in the air, that even when I was smoking, there was no cigarette in my hands. I started cultivating the attitudes and habits of a non-smoker. Smoking is like licking an ashtray, and it's in your clothes, it's disgusting. And it took about 6 months, but there was a certain point where the old one came up, and when that old picture comes up, it likes to hang on. So there was a time when I was craving cigarettes even more. But at a certain point, I hung in there. Then I woke up one day, and it was like, oh, I don't need to do this anymore. And I went through about 3 days of physical withdrawal and other kind of things. But after that, I have never smoked a cigarette, and I have never craved a cigarette, for the simple reason that non-smokers don't crave cigarettes. In other words, the problem for many people when they want to change something that's stored is the fact that they are trying to override the system, not the stored picture. And so if I see myself as a smoker, but I quit smoking, I'm going to crave it. So that's one of the things that we need to do. Find out what the rocks are, how do we get them out, and how do we open ourselves up. So here's what you can do. You observe yourself. There are signs that you're keeping yourself in a box, and one way is absolute statements. Do you talk this way? When I work with teams in Silicon Valley, I'll just go to their meetings and listen to them talk. And whenever I hear anybody talk in terms of absolute statements, I know right away, these people could have blind spots to anything that contradicts what they absolutely believe, okay? So language like everyone knows that he's always like this. They never do it that way. There's no use in doing it that way. We've always done it this way. In other words, they lock on to something. And when you lock on, you lock out. So does locking onto an absolute truth blind you? There was a 2008 study, attitude certainty. When you absolutely know something's true, it increases all resistance to persuasion. If the problem is being absolute, you cross the line and you will create rocks in your head just by being absolute. How else do you do it? All right, lock on, lock out. I know this is true, lock on. Evidence to the contrary gets locked out, okay? True scholars do not lock on. Truth seekers do not lock on. So what is it that you lock onto? What is it that you absolutely know is true and you won't hear anything else? Okay, one of the ways of discovering if you have rocks in your head, blind spots in any endeavor, is emotional triggers. Somebody brings up a topic or somebody brings up a person and you go, that right there indicates a blind spot. And often, this is why it's used in advertising. They like to program things into you. You know, hey, if you buy our beer, you could be on the beach and the women will rise up out of the sand and dance and love you, you know, things like that. This imagery plays over and over. Trust me, advertisers know that you have a subconscious repository and an adaptive unconscious. And so they will frame things in such a way to put certain images in your head to get implanted so your behavior starts changing, you know, according to what profits them. Same with politicians, you know, this is how propaganda works. If I can, before you hear somebody or talk to them, demonize them in a certain way and make them evil or whatever, I can plant an emotional trigger inside of you that you don't even know is there. That functions like a landmine. This is why I don't talk to politics with anybody anymore, for the simple reason is most people have landmines and they don't even know it, and they blow up and it becomes a mess. By the way, no political party will have me because this is a problem for everybody. But the point is, if you're investigating yourself and you want to know where your blind spots are, look for that emotional trigger. Look for, you know, that kind of thing with people, data, reality, whatever it is. Also, if you have blind spots, it makes it so easy to slide into ad hominem personal attacks, the power of ridicule. Do you speak that language? Have you picked it up from other people? Do you have this tendency to want to ridicule others? Wherever that tendency lies, it's a good sign that you have a blind spot. And even for Oxfordians, Orthodox Shakespeare scholars can make good points. Don't demonize them. They can have something that, a piece to the puzzle that you may miss otherwise. Detachment versus emotional attachment. Learning how to be detached. True scholars, true truth seekers, detach themselves, right? If you attach yourself too much to something, especially if you make it part of your livelihood, that's a good way of it creating blind spots. Gosh, if I go down this path, it may affect my ability to support my family. It can be a disaster. Same with my reputation. This is why there's people, academics in universities, professors, who are very sympathetic to an Oxfordian understanding of Shakespeare, but they're not going to come out with it publicly. They're not going to, you know, because of peer pressure. Their reputation could suffer. And some people just don't. It takes an extraordinary person to hang in there with the truth at every level. So when you engage in scholarly work, develop a scholarly detachment. Beware of identifying your work. I remember over maybe 12, 15 years ago being at a Shakespeare Studies conference up in Oregon, and there was one presenter making a case for something that pretty much was based on the understanding of one word. And early on in the presentation, somebody in the audience corrected him, said, wait a minute, that's not what that word meant at that time. This is what it means. And it totally blew up the person's presentation. If that had been me, I think I probably would have honestly said, well, thank you very much. Sorry to waste your time. And I would have graciously bowed out. This person couldn't do it. They were so wrapped up in their discovery that they kind of frenetically went to the end. It was sad to see. But this is what happens if you attach yourself too much to your original work. Absolute certainty is your enemy. Absolute certainty is your enemy. Anything you say you absolutely know is true, that in and of itself is enough to do something in your mind to make sure you don't see any evidence contrary to what you absolutely know is true. When you lock on, you lock out. Be careful what you're locking onto in your life. As an Oxfordian scholar, cultivate a habit in being at maximum 95% certain. Me, I'm 95% certain that Edward de Vere is the author of the plays. That's as far as I'm willing to go, 95%, because so much evidence is underground. We're just seeing peaks of things, and we're trying to connect dots. But a certain piece of evidence can shift things, and if I'm going to see that evidence, I have to just come short of being absolutely certain and keep that scholarly detachment. Even though I've written about it, even though I advocate it, there's a part of me that knows something tomorrow could give me a completely different understanding. So I'm always open to new evidence and new arguments. And that for me is the definition of a true scholar. Understand that your subconscious repository stores anything repeated. Your thoughts create a reality in a very significant way. Not in terms of just your habits and attitudes and preferences, but your fundamental identity. Who are you? Anything that you have completely invested in for your identity or the nature of reality, the more you lock onto that, the more you say certain things, they get stored. So if you want to have an interesting time into yourself and you want to explore new possibilities, start questioning everything, at least open doubt. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe somebody else has some understanding that I don't have. It can serve you well if you're a truth seeker. So, in the spirit of Richard Feynman, to all Oxfordian scholarship is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Beware of becoming an expert. By the way, there are two types of people in this world: those who can extrapolate from incomplete data. That's for the engineers in the audience. By the way, if you want to see go deeper into this is the book I give the engineers, Creating Your Life. It's also written as a public version of it, not an engineer's version. You can go to my Shakespeare Authorship source book. I have a source book because I'm a strong believer in going to original sources rather than relying just on people's interpretations. If you want to see things other people aren't seeing, go back and read the originals. I have a slew of links to PDFs or placed on websites that have a lot of Elizabethan links as well as more recent things. That's at sourcetext.com/sourcebook. You can go to my website, marcandrealexander.com. There's a contact page. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And with that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark Andre Alexander, for a fascinating presentation. My own personal mind is completely blown. First of all, did you see the gorilla? No, I'm just kidding. But wow, wasn't that a magnificent thing? Because look at how when we focus on one thing, we miss so many other things. And it was so profound to listen to Mark and to connect what he was saying, not only to the Oxfordian movement and the Shakespeare authorship question, but as he mentioned about advertising and propaganda and the media and all of these things where these experts know this stuff about our brains and then use it against us and trigger us the way that they do. And I hope now in your inquest into this magnificent mystery of Shakespeare authorship, you have a different mindset about how you're going to investigate and how you're going to keep asking questions. And you remember that is always the theme of our podcast series. I want to take a few moments to remind you about our podcast series. The Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship started the podcast series almost 2 years ago. Don't Quill the Messenger. And if you haven't already, you need to go and find those episodes. We have more than 40 episodes recorded now on a variety of different aspects and issues and angles connected to Shakespeare authorship. Some of my favorites involve some of our scholars and presenters who you're going to see later on today. And if you haven't already gone there and found some episodes to help intrigue your mind, please do that. Don't forget, later on today, we're going to be showing you how a podcast episode is recorded with basically Don't Quill the Messenger live right here on our YouTube channel as I welcome Dr. Earl Showerman in front of the camera, and we have a great podcast-style discussion about 10 eyewitnesses who saw nothing. And that'll be a fascinating conversation as well. Before we move forward into our program, I also want to remind you, don't forget, we will be announcing later today the Oxfordian of the Year. And coming up in just a few minutes, we have a presentation from the 2019 Oxfordian of the Year, Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. And it's a fascinating presentation about Shakespeare the auteur. Cheryl is a professor at a university in Massachusetts, and she teaches a class about film, and it revolves around the auteurs of filmmaking, and she'll describe that more in her presentation. If you recall, if you are a regular podcast listener, we did an episode not too long ago, Cheryl and I, about that very subject. So she'll be expounding upon that further in today's presentation. But before we move forward, I do want to also remind you we'll be announcing the winners of our Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest later today. And before we move on, I want to introduce you to, again, one of what I believe is the greatest hits of our Shakespeare video contest, and see if you can recognize this guy.
I'm Mark Andre Alexander. Many claim that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, is Shakespeare's Hamlet, but I'm here to assure you it's just a coincidence. Scholars have noted the parallels between Polonius and William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and even how Burleigh's daughter Anne marries the fair Ophelia. And sure, Oxford did grow up in Burleigh's household and marry his daughter, but it's just a coincidence. Scholars believe that Cardan's Comfort is the kind of book Hamlet would read, and sure, the 1571 translation of Cardan's Comfort was dedicated to Oxford, but it's just a coincidence. Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier is associated with both Hamlet and Shakespeare's idea of courtliness. And yes, Oxford did write the Latin preface to the 1572 translation, but it's just a coincidence. Shakespeare was immersed in Arthur Golding's English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Arthur Golding was Oxford's uncle and both did live at Cecil House, but it's just a coincidence. As you know, pirates attacked Hamlet in the English Channel, and pirates also attacked Oxford in the English Channel. And many silly upstarts like to point out that both were noblemen and courtiers, had mothers who remarried after their father's death, were spied upon by their fathers-in-law who were both counselors to the throne, or patrons and players and playwrights, had lovers accused of infidelity who died early and were thought mad at court. But it's just a coincidence. Scholars believe Shakespeare visited Italy due to his profound knowledge of the country, and Shakespeare does make reference to Venice, Genoa, Milan, Padua, Florence, Verona, Messina, and Sicily, and sure, Oxford visited all these places, but it's just a coincidence. The English poet and dramatist John Lilly was a great influence on Shakespeare's comedy, and yes, he was Oxford's secretary, to whhom he dedicated his Euphues and his England. Scholars also see ties between Shakespeare and playwright Anthony Munday, who worked for Oxford and dedicated several of his works to him. But it's just a coincidence! Shakespeare dedicated his poem Venus and Adonis to Henry Roseley, the Earl of Southampton, and sure, Burleigh did approach Southampton to marry Oxford's daughter Elizabeth. But it's just a coincidence! The first folio is dedicated to the brothers William and Philip, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, and Pembroke was once in negotiations with Burleigh to marry Oxford's daughter Bridget Vere, while Montgomery actually did marry Oxford's daughter Susan Vere. But it's just a coincidence! We know Hamlet has a fanatical sense of truth, in that in one place Shakespeare does say truth is truth to the end of reckoning. But so what if Oxford used a similar phrase in a private letter to Robert Cecil, or that Oxford Latin motto can be translated as nothing truer than truth? It's all just a damn coincidence!
Hope you enjoyed that one. It's always one of my favorites. It's just a coincidence. Well, what isn't a coincidence is that our next presenter is the 2019 Oxfordian of the Year. Her name is Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, and she's about to present to you Shakespeare Authorship. Here it is.
I'd like to thank the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship for inviting me to speak at the 2020 Authorship Symposium, and special thanks to the conference committee and members Earl Showerman and Stephen Sabel for organizing this event. I'd also like to thank AV Presentations for producing this video, and I'd like to remember our colleague Tom Renier, to whom this event is dedicated. My name is Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and a teacher. My documentary film, Nothing is Truer Than Truth, about Edward de Vere, is available on Amazon Prime and Hulu in the US and Canada, and will soon be released in the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world as Shakespeare, the Man Behind the Name. While teaching Shakespeare screenwriting and filmmaking, I discovered that Shakespeare's characters could be very instructive when crafting scripts. I'm currently working on a book, Shakespeare Authorship, Creating Authentic Characters for the Screen, an exploration of the auteur tradition and its creative implications for screenwriters. It focuses on Shakespeare as the original auteur, a writer-director who infused his work with his own life experience to create three-dimensional, multifaceted characters. The book will explore the techniques used by Shakespeare and other writer-directors from the French New Wave through the 21st century to provide screenwriters with tangible methods to develop effective on-screen heroes. Today, I'll focus on the way that de Vere's creative method parallels that of other auteurs, from Godard, Truffaut, Kurosawa, and Fellini, to 21st century writer-directors like Christopher Nolan, Wes Anderson, Gus Van Sant, Greta Gerwig, and Spike Lee. Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, Lear, Falstaff. What makes these characters so memorable? What do directors Godard, Truffaut, Wells, and Kurosawa bring to their screen characters that render them indelible? These artists all employed the process of combining archetypes with individual personality traits and the integration of lived experience to create truly unique yet iconic characters. The auteur theory was first articulated by French director François Truffaut in his now seminal article in Cahiers du cinéma, une certaine tendance du cinéma français. The idea was subsequently expanded upon and further defined by his Cahiers colleagues, André Bazin, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivet, Claude Chabrol, and Feridun Hoveyda. The auteur theory reimagines the role of the film director as the author of a work, as one who creates the world in a manner that surpasses and supersedes that employed by the screenwriter, or when the director also writes the script, fuses the two roles into one, where the effect is not just synthesis, but a kind of alchemy. In either case, the director transforms the written work into a reflection of his own unique vision, based on his own life experiences, resulting in a synergy that exceeds the capacity of text alone. I contend that this process is precisely what makes the works of Shakespeare far superior to the plays and poems of his contemporaries. His understanding of the principles of staging a play, constructing a narrative framework through the use of syntax and experimentation in form, and perhaps most clearly, as detailed by Mark Anderson in the book Shakespeare by Another Name, integrating elements of his own life into the works. To be clear, we cannot make this analogy with the man from Stratford, William Shakespeare, as the author. Despite the efforts of writers throughout modern history to retrofit the life of Will to the world of the plays and poems, including the most recent entry, Hamlet, a new novel by Maggie O'Farrell, we must recognize Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, as the author writing under the pseudonym Shakespeare for the crucial underpinnings of the auteur theory to apply to the genius of the bard. Although the phrase auteur theory has been attributed to the American film critic Andrew Sarris, writing in a 1963 article for Film Culture, the concept was developed by the Young Turks of the Cahiers Journal. Truffaut and Godard, who used the pseudonym Hans Lucas, began writing for the journal in 1952. Another important writer at the journal was Eric Romer, who wrote under his real name, Maurice Scherer, before becoming editor. But it was the publication of Truffaut's Une certaine tendance in January 1954 that marked the beginning of a new era at the journal and in film. His article addresses the issue of authorship, something Oxfordian scholars are very interested in. Truffaut quotes another auteur, Orson Welles, who declared, "I believe a work is good to the degree that it expresses the man who created it." Eric Rode explains the concept. The director was seen as the ultimate authority and sole arbiter of a film's meaning. They required one meaning only, that the director should have a strong personality and that he should be able to project his convictions. This was contrasted with the works of the old guard screenwriters, Jean Aranchet and Pierre Bost, who, for Truffaut, lack authenticity and personality because they collaborate with the most diverse directors on a wide diversity of themes. Jean-José Richer called it the most important thing to an artist, a temperament. This can also be said of Edward de Vere. The writers argued that the true auteur possesses not just any worldview, but rather a particular worldview. Truffaut accused Aranchet and Bost of writing scripts for films that manifested a distinctly negative view of the world. A perfect example of this can be seen in the endings to their 1952 Oscar-winning adaptation Forbidden Games when compared with Truffaut's 1959 masterpiece The 400 Blows, which won Best Director at Cannes that year and was also nominated for an Academy Award. I screen both of these films in my Masterpieces of World Cinema class, and my students always complain that Forbidden Games is the saddest, most depressing film they've ever seen. Its post-war nihilism is so stark and bleak that the film's screenwriters even felt compelled to write an alternative ending that suggests that it was just a fable from a storybook. The ending to 400 Blows was, especially at the time, radical in its indeterminacy and optimism. The ending offers the slightest glimmer of hope for its hero, Antoine Doinel. When we compare Shakespeare with his contemporaries in my world drama class, we can see this same contrast. We read Twelfth Night and Volpone, as well as Hamlet, The Spanish Tragedy, Dr. Faustus, and The Duchess of Malfi. The different worldviews of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, for example, are immediately clear to my students. Are people inherently good or evil? Some students also compared Volpone with Merchant of Venice, noting the themes of justice and mercy, as opposed to Jonson's focus on greed and corruption. Even though Jonson gives us Celia and Benario as examples of human potential, his satire comes from a very different perception of the Elizabethan world than Shakespeare's. Shakespeare is, of course, a humanist, and De Vere as Shakespeare embodies this perspective. In fact, he meets with the humanist Johannes Sturmius during his trip to Europe. According to American film critic John Hess, the most important determinant of an auteur was not so much the director's ability to express his personality, but rather his desire and ability to express a certain worldview. An auteur expressed an optimistic image of human potentialities within an utterly corrupt society. The work of the director connected audiences to transcend the isolation imposed on one by a corrupt world. This romantic notion parallels the ideology of André Malraux, who wrote of the ability of art to transcend history. An artist's supreme work is not the one best in accord with any tradition, not even his most complete and finished work, but his most personal work, the one from which he has stripped all that is not his own, and in which his style reaches its climax. We can apply this theory to a director like Fellini, whose work progresses from the post-war influence of the neo-realists to the optimism of the new wave in Nights of Cabiria, and culminates in his most self-reflective films, such as 8½, and to Shakespeare, whose early works are based on classical Greek and Roman sources, English history, and draw on the Commedia dell'arte, and whose later works, according to Oxfordian dating, reflect a narrative structure that is highly innovative and individual, and a sophistication in syntax, as in the sonnets, that remains unequaled. Why do we find the character Hamlet so compelling? How did Shakespeare imbue the character with such complexity and such a conflicted nature? Could it be because Hamlet embodies the author's struggle throughout his own life to reconcile competing concepts of honor, duty, love, and truth? Shakespeare's attempt to understand the human psyche, as it has been observed by so many scholars, is a recurring theme through all of his plays and poems. As Fellini observed, all art is autobiographical. The pearl is the oyster's autobiography. Fellini also based his films on his life growing up in Rimini and later as a young man on the Via Veneto in Rome, as seen in his great film La Dolce Vita. Fellini was obsessed with American comic books when he was young. He worked as a sketch artist and a cartoonist before moving to Rome and drawing caricatures for American tourists on the Via Veneto. He wrote stories for magazines and eventually began working as a screenwriter for Roberto Rossellini. The world that Fellini creates in his films is an amazing synthesis of memory, dreams, and reality. He uses everything in his experience to bring his characters to life. No detail is spared. Truffaut similarly drew on his childhood and his adventures as a young man. He had a very traumatic childhood that is recounted with humor and beauty in The 400 Blows, the title of which has often been misunderstood. It comes from a French idiom which means to raise hell. Antoine Doinel is Truffaut's most iconic character. He goes on to star in 4 films and is based in large part on Truffaut's own experiences growing up in France. Akira Kurosawa, whose father was a samurai, trained as a painter, and his films use light as a painter might. He worshipped his older brother, Haigo, a silent film narrator who introduced him to the world of film, and whose suicide devastated the then 23-year-old Akira. That same year, Akira lost his other brother. These events may have been the impetus for his prolific output as a director. He wrote and directed 30 films, many of which included themes of a master-disciple relationship. Like Edward de Vere, Kurosawa looked to the works of the masters and reimagined them to reflect the world he knew. Inspired by the works of Shakespeare, he made brilliant adaptations of Macbeth and King Lear, each rendered with vivid details and emotion. In Throne of Blood, he sets the Scottish play in feudal Japan and uses elements of no theater to give the film its uncanny sense of dread and doom. In an interesting parallel to his Kaye contemporaries, Kurosawa wrote an essay that mocked the deficiencies of the existing Japanese film industry, which landed him his first studio job as an assistant director. Jean-Luc Godard also used elements from his own life to craft the films that made him famous in the late 50s and early 60s. Breathless, co-written with Truffaut, features characters based on Godard's circle of friends and acquaintances and is set in his neighborhood in Paris. Like Kurosawa, Godard used jump cuts and other innovations in editing that gave his films a distinctively modern style. Although initially inspired by a newspaper article about a man who stole a car and killed a motorcycle cop, the character Michel becomes larger than life through Godard's technique of attributing the personality of his colleague screenwriter Paul Gauguin, known as a womanizing cad, to his protagonist, and launching Jean-Paul Belmondo's career as a result. Here, the archetype of the anti-hero is expertly fused with the unique traits of a member of the Cahiers collective. The film also references many literary sources, composers, and artists, as do the early works of Shakespeare. His next film, 1961's A Woman is a Woman, incorporates his relationship with its star, Anna Karenina, his muse and first wife. When we understand De Vere's relationship with his first wife, Anne Cecil, many of the plays take on deeper meaning. Her influence on the works of Shakespeare spans his lifetime, from his early disregard, jealousy, and suspicions to his later remorse and regret at having treated her so badly. When an auteur sets his story on the streets and in the cafes he frequents, on the battlefields of his ancestors, and in the details from dreams and memories of his youth, the narrative world that emerges is like no other. It is at once recognizable and foreign, uncharted territory, just as his characters are simultaneously universal and entirely unique. Today's auteurs continue the tradition. Born in London in 1970, Christopher Nolan began making films at the age of 7, using his father's Super 8mm camera and an assortment of male action figures. Nolan explores the notions of time, memory, and what it means to be a writer in all of his films, from his college thesis project, Following, to his soon-to-be-released Tenet. He is always experimenting with form, as in Inception and Dunkirk, and wrote several of his screenplays with his brother Jonathan, including the iconic Batman trilogy. He insists on shooting only on film, never digital video. Nolan embodies the final tenet of auteur theory, mise en scène. Feridun Haveda explains in the 1960 Cahiers article, "The originality of the auteur lies not in the subject matter he chooses, but in the technique he employs, the mise en scène through which everything on the screen is expressed. As Sartre said, one isn't a writer for having chosen to say certain things, but having chosen to say them in a certain way. Why should it be any different for cinema?" He continues, "What matters in a film is the desire for order, composition, harmony, the placing of action and objects, the movements within the frame, the capturing of a moment or a look. In short, the intellectual operation which has put an initial emotion and a general idea to work. Mise en scène is nothing other than the technique invented by each director to express the idea and establish the specific quality of his work. The task of the critic thus becomes immense, to discover behind the images the particular manner of the auteur, and thanks to this knowledge, to be able to elucidate the meaning of the work in question." Anyone who has studied the works of Shakespeare understands the immensity of this undertaking. We are constantly searching for meaning behind the structure and devices of the plays and poems. The exquisite skill in staging scenes is evident throughout the Shakespeare canon, from the opening scene of Hamlet to the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, to the approach of Birnam Wood in Macbeth, to the fantasy worlds of A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. The visual worlds Shakespeare creates continue to inspire stage and screen directors. The derivation of the phrase mise en scène is from the theater. Its literal translation is placing on the stage, in reference to staging a written text. Shakespeare's plays, as written, contain very few stage directions. The actors and directors know how to perform and stage the work through the dialogue alone. Stephen Sabel gave an excellent talk on this topic at the Ashland Summer Seminar last year. Wes Anderson creates elaborate storyboards for his visually lush films like The Royal Tenenbaums, Moonrise Kingdom, and The Grand Budapest Hotel. He used his high school as a location for his film Rushmore, and like Nolan, he began making silent Super 8mm films as a child and aspired to be a writer. His unique style includes innovative use of camera movements and highly saturated color. In My Own Private Idaho, director Gus Van Sant was clearly inspired by Shakespeare's Henry IV Part I, as well as by Orson Welles' masterful interpretation of the play and Shakespeare's Falstaff, Chimes at Midnight. But what makes Private Idaho unique is the way in which Van Sant references his own experiences in Portland, Oregon, incorporating street kids and hustlers from his neighborhood as Prince Hal's companions at the Boar's Head, and casting Falstaff as the leader of the group in a role not unlike Fagin in Oliver Twist. Spike Lee established his talent as a writer-director with his iconic film Do the Right Thing, set in the very visceral Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, with vivid characters from his world. Its relevance today attests to Lee's vision. He dedicated the 1989 film to the families of 6 victims of police brutality or racial violence. Lee has made more than 35 films, including 2018's Academy Award winner Black Klansman, based on a memoir but brought to life in the director's distinctive style. Writer-director Greta Gerwig's breakout film, Lady Bird, nominated for an Academy Award, gave us a truly original protagonist, combining the archetypal rebellious teenager with an unexpectedly complex intellectual young woman, drawing on her own experiences in a Catholic high school and set in her hometown of Sacramento, California. Gerwig next adapted the classic Little Women, also nominated for an Academy Award, bringing her own distinctly modern feminist viewpoint to the story. In Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare, we have a writer-director with a strong personality. He was, by all accounts, a very temperamental man who possessed a specific humanist view of the world, who was expert at placing his words on the stage, who drew extensively on the people and places in his life to reimagine source texts from the Greeks through the Renaissance, and through this method, he created the unforgettable characters that launched the careers of many great actors. Shakespeare was the first auteur.
As a longtime theater artist, I can't agree more with Cheryl about her findings and the things that she pointed out in her presentation with regards to how an artist puts themselves into their work. And certainly our author had his own special, unique sense of style. And as we've seen through our research and through our studies, and even through the coincidence that we saw Mark Alexander point out recently, the truth is that the Shakespearean canon has Edward de Vere written all over it. Before we move forward to our next presentation, I want to take you back to another greatest hit from our video contest. This one happens to be one of my all-time favorites, and I think it will have you asking some questions and looking at those professorial blind spots that somebody may have given you in your lifetime. Here it is.
Hello, Professor. Olivia Connors here. I was in your English Lit class fall semester. Remember? I'm the one you shut down during class when I asked about the lost years in Shakespeare's life. You dismissed my question and rambled on about conspiracy theories and the authorship question. I didn't even know there was an authorship question. I was just confused. I mean, how could there be so little known about the famous Shakespeare when so much was known about his less famous contemporaries? So I did my own research. Spring break. I read 33 books on the subject and discovered that this authorship question is completely backward. No evidence that the Stratford man actually is the author. It's a lot of presumptions, no proof. Seems to me that the Stratfordian should be on the defense instead of, the other way around. Anyway, I'm making this little video to share my research. I'll talk fast and keep it short. Apparently, skepticism goes way back. Sigmund Freud, Walt Whitman, Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Helen Keller, and Mark Twain wrote a whole book questioning authorship. Actors, authors, statesmen, Supreme Court justices, plenty of skeptics and questions like why was the Stratford man baptized Shakespeare, referred to as Shakespeare, and spells the name different configurations of Shakespeare? Why no record of him attending university? Did you know the Stratford man didn't own a single book, play script, any letters, correspondence? I mean, he's a writer. He didn't write? He was never mentioned as a playwright within his own family or hometown. Wouldn't they want to brag? No eulogy at his funeral, no public mourning, but he was famous. So is it possible the Stratford upon Avon Shakespeare didn't really write Shakespeare? Then who did? Now this is where it really gets interesting. A British school teacher named Thomas Loney back in 1920 asked that question and approached the authorship as a detective trying to solve a crime. He came up with a profile based on the writings only, and after years of research, Loney found a match. A man obscured by time, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, a little-known author of poetry and plays in the court of Queen Elizabeth. Because of his title, he could only publish using a pseudonym. Lots of authors use them even today. Interesting idea, huh? In fact, de Vere's whole life was interesting. Fascinating, actually. Although a little bit embarrassing for his family. He was a rich earl, after all, with plenty of time and money for shenanigans. A life that actually paralleled Hamlet's. Best tutors, access to the best library in England, Cambridge University at 14, law school at 17, proficient in French, Latin, Greek, educated in medicine, military, mythology, seamanship, horsemanship, gardening. He spent a whole year traveling throughout Italy, Verona, Venice. De Vere owned 2 acting companies. And I love this. A Geneva Bible belonging to de Vere survived with handwritten notes in the margins used in Shakespeare's plays and sonnets. And where is this Bible now? In the Folger Shakespeare Library. What? Professor, just question. Like me, you'll find plenty of reasonable doubt. You're a student once, I bet you question everything. Do we ever stop learning? Don't close the book, Professor. Just turn the page for the sake of all your students. Please?
Olivia Canis, she is one of my all-time heroes. Just question, ask the questions, turn the page. Before we move forward to our next presentation, we want to remind you that we are accepting donations at our website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Right there on the home page, you can find our podcast series. You can find other videos to our YouTube collection of presentations. You can find Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship swag. Buy a coffee mug, a t-shirt, a water bottle. What a great conversation piece to get people started talking about the greatest literary mystery of all time. You can find the rest of today's presentation schedule, and you can also find a great way to donate to the organization to help support our wonderful programs and outreach options. Don't forget that your donation helps fund our research grant program, where we award up to $20,000 per year to qualified scholars to conduct further research into the Shakespeare authorship question. Our podcast series, which receives up to 1,000 listeners per episode every 2 weeks. Also, our video program, our video contest, which we'll be announcing the winners later on this afternoon, and the prize money that we use to devote to that, which this year helped generate more than 10,000 views on our Facebook page through our promotions of the video contest. That's an incredible outreach program. So your donation helps support those outreach programs to help spread the word of the truth of Edward de Vere as the true author Shakespeare. Don't forget, if you donate up to at least $250, you will be immediately entered into a drawing to receive this beautiful bust commissioned by Ben August by the artist Paula Slater. For every $250 donation, you receive an entry to win. So if you donate $1,000, that's 4 entries to win. If you have previously donated this year, but not a total of $250, you can add to that contribution to hit the $250 level, and that will immediately enter you into the drawing. We're going to leave that open all week long through 5 o'clock Saturday, October 10th. That's 1 week from today. And so all through the week, you can send in your donations, and we'll make sure that you're entered. And we will have the drawing on Sunday, October 11th, and we'll announce that through our website and through our email subscriber list. If you haven't already joined our email subscriber list, you can do that from the homepage as well. And remember, we don't share our lists with anyone ever, and we only use it to send you pertinent information about what's happening with the organization. If you're not already a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, please consider joining. Membership entitles you to discounts on our conferences and events. You'll receive the quarterly newsletter full of information and details about the latest scholarship, book reviews, and other activities going on throughout the world, the entire world, because we have members across the world in different parts of the globe and in different countries, and they send us and contribute to that newsletter. You'll also find out information. Ooh, the dog thinks it's exciting too. You'll also find out information about the conference ahead of time for what's happening next fall. And as I mentioned earlier today, we do hope to be back in Ashland, Oregon next fall for our annual conference. So please consider membership. There are different levels of membership. Students can join for free with proof of their enrollment in a college or a university. There are individual memberships, couple memberships, and family memberships available as well. You can even give a gift membership. And as we approach, I know it's only October, but as we approach the holiday season coming, wouldn't it be a great gift to give somebody a membership to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship? The last 2 years, when I've renewed my membership, I have also purchased a gift membership for a family member. It's a wonderful way to introduce them to this organization that I'm a part of, that I'm so passionate about, and they receive that quarterly newsletter, and it helps introduce them in a very calm and interesting way that then causes them, we hope, to continue to ask questions about this. And you'd be surprised the reactions that I've received from my 2 gift recipients over the last 2 years. So won't you consider giving a gift membership to a friend or family member who you would like to encourage to keep asking questions about this wonderful mystery. Now, on to our next presenter. His name is Professor Sky Gilbert, and he is a professor of theater and literature at Guelph University. He was recently a guest on the podcast series, and you can go to the podcast page and find that episode where he talked about, at the time, his upcoming book, Shakespeare Beyond Science, When Poetry Was the World, and that's the title of his presentation, which you're going to enjoy right now.
Hi, my name is Sky Gilbert, and I'm here to tell you about my book, Shakespeare Beyond Science, When Poetry Was the World. This book is just been published, and it will be released and on Amazon in September. I'm very proud of it, and I think it has great relevance to the whole Oxfordian position, and has lots to say to us as Oxfordians. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book. I'm going to, first of all, say that the book is about Shakespeare's rhetoric. It's a book which defines Shakespeare as a rhetorician primarily, which means an aesthete, which means someone who was in love with poetry, and also to some degree was distrustful of it and even hated it, but loved it mostly, but both. It's very confusing, but it's all about rhetoric. And I suggest that is actually the subject matter of his plays, not moralism, not sort of what do we do, what's right or wrong, not instruction, but instead aesthetics, instead art. The subject of his work is art and poetry and its place in our lives. I'm going to talk about 4 people: Hermogenes, John Lilly, also David Garrick, and finally Petrus Ramus. And these 4 people are very important in terms of my book. John Lilly was Edward de Vere's secretary, and he is a writer credited with inventing the euphuistic style. The main thesis of my book is that Shakespeare wrote at a time when poetry was the world. What does this mean? It means that people learned about the world through poetry, not through examining it through a microscope, not through science. And this is because poetry and all rhetoric meant a mixture of style and content. In other words, there was no separation between what a poem said and how it was formed or what the style of that poem was. And I think Shakespeare believed that style and content were the same thing. The main stylistic element utilized by Shakespeare is paradox, and you, of course, can find this in The Witches and Macbeth when they say fair is foul and foul is fair, but it's constantly all over Shakespeare, everywhere. It seems he's incapable sometimes of mentioning anything without mentioning its opposite. And it's really easy, I think, to understand how style is content if you look at paradox, because with paradox, you have a view of the world in which you believe that good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, all exist together in the world, and that we somehow have to accept that. And it isn't so much, and not judge it in a way, because paradox sets these two things constantly opposite, side by side, and yet says that's the way it kind of is. And it doesn't mean, of course, that we can't, sit up to right the wrongs, but the work is not about that. The work is about just showing us the world in all its glory and all its fear and all its love and all its hate and all its beauty. So the style of paradox, the stylistic element, paradox, has content. Paradox was the primary element used by Lilly, and it was also, as I say, the primary element used by Shakespeare. So I believe that Shakespeare may have written, and I'm not the only one who believes this, the early plays of John Lilly, because they seem to be kind of drafts of later Shakespeare plays, or that Lilly was in Shakespeare's inner circle, and that his style, his literary circle, his style, Lilly's style, euphuism, it's not euphemism, it's euphuism, the overly ornate style, filled with paradox, became the Shakespeare style in later years, and that Lilly's writing was kind of a tryout for that. And the reason why I mention Lilly is because it accentuates the paradoxical elements in Shakespeare's work to compare his work to Lilly's. I also want to talk about Hermogenes. Hermogenes was a Greek rhetorician who did most of his work from 161 to 180 AD. I believe that Johannes Sturm was Shakespeare's teacher. And Johannes Sturm, because we know that de Vere, for instance, visited Johannes Sturm, who was a great educator in Germany. And Sturm's expertise was in the area of Hermogenes. And Hermogenes was a Neoplatonist. He was which means basically a very mystical poet and a stylist who wrote about in the context of beauty and love. That's what Neoplatonism is the equation of beauty and love and truth. So Hermogenes was a Greek rhetorician taught by Sturm. De Vere went to Germany to take classes or to visit Sterne, we know that. And I'm almost 100% certain that he learned about Hermogenes there and incorporated Hermogenes' teachings. Now, Hermogenes is significant because he's very different than Cicero. And Cicero is who we usually associate, the rhetorician. He's a Greek rhetorician who we usually associate with Shakespeare. And for Cicero, there were just three styles. The grand and the, I think the regular and then the low style. And you use them separately. So you were either writing a tragedy in the grand style or you're writing a comedy in the low style. And we all know that with Shakespeare's work, it's very different. Shakespeare's work is filled with contrasting styles. Now, Hermogenes believed there were not just 3 styles of writing, but 21 styles. There's one style called solemnity, one style called asperity, and there's one style just called clarity. And the final of his 21 styles was actually a combination of all of the styles. And that's what he believed the ideal style was that you were constantly shifting from one style to another within one speech, of course, within one play, within one poem. And this is actually the most characteristic thing, I think, about Shakespeare's style, is that it is not only the use of paradox, but the fact that it is constantly shifting. For instance, Hamlet's famous speech, to be or not to be, starts out with clarity, with a very clear statement, to be or not to be, that is the question. And then it jumps to solemnity, or grandeur, I think it is, when he talks about, the sea slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So Shakespeare, this was uncommon. This was not the way writers wrote at that time. They decided on one style and stuck to it, and there are only 3. Instead, Shakespeare uses many, many styles right up against each other, and suddenly a character's colloquial, is speaking in slang or in a very immediate way, and then suddenly speaking in dense metaphorical poetry. And I think that Shakespeare learned this from Hermogenes. The other very important person we need to talk about is Petrus Ramus. He was the philosopher who destroyed rhetoric. That's why I don't like him. But anyway, he's not famous because he wasn't a very good philosopher. His teachings were, his books are just not very good. They're not as good as Isaac Newton, let's say. But Ramus was one of the first scientists, and what he suggested is that rhetoric was, before that, the way we learned about the world. In other words, we learned about the world through poetry. What Ramus said was, well, look at a poem. He was like a bad English teacher. He said, look at a poem and divide it between its style and its content. They're 2 separate things. And we don't care about the style. The style is frippery. It's adornment. It's been added there. It's actually kind of dangerous and kind of deceiving. And instead, what we have to do is we have to look at what does it say, and what is the moral idea, and what is the syllogism? In other words, what is the logic of the poem? What is it saying? What's its message? And that would be the way he'd analyze poetry, and that is the way he thought art should be and rhetoric should be. It should not be this world of paradoxes and many different style and content of the same thing. It should be a clear message with the content separated from the style, which was not important. So in this way, Ramus basically destroyed rhetoric. It never was what it was after that. Dialectics took over. There were 3 parts of the classical trivium: dialectics, grammar, and the classical trivium was the curriculum in the Renaissance time. And the 3 parts were grammar and rhetoric and dialectics. And basically what happens is Ramus said dialectics should be in charge. That's the most important element. And rhetoric should be pushed aside. And we should be very suspicious of double meanings and puns and paradoxes and lack of clarity in style. And I would say that probably Shakespeare's singular characteristic as a stylist is his lack of clarity. And by that, I don't mean, of course, he doesn't communicate. He communicates beautifully, but he communicates very densely, and also many of his images seem to have many meanings or many associations or many resonances. And this was, Ramus didn't like this kind of language. And he was backed up by the Royal Society, which was a English society which formed in 1660. It was devoted to experimentation. in one of the most early scientific organizations. Isaac Newton eventually was a member. And the Royal Society did not like puns. They policed language. They did not like double meanings. And they did not like essentially what I would say Shakespeare's poetry was all about. And they didn't speak against Shakespeare, but they spoke against a certain kind of language, which they considered to be imprecise and not scientific. The final person I'm going to talk about is David Garrick. David Garrick is known as the Bardilator, which means that he made an icon of Shakespeare. This was around 1760. He was a director and a performer, and he had a huge jubilee where he celebrated Shakespeare. And he was really the first person to popularize Shakespeare, or one of the very first, about 150 years after his death. And suddenly, the reason we could love Shakespeare so much was because he was a good man and a moral man. And his plays had messages, and those messages were to improve us and make us better people. So he had to rewrite Shakespeare's plays, because Shakespeare's plays, I believe, that they're just not these kind of, clear moral messages. They're much more complex than that. And so he had to, for instance, rewrite Macbeth, and Macbeth has a wonderful death in Garrick's version, where he's being pulled out to hell, and oh, don't take me, I don't want to go, I've been evil, I've been bad, I'm being punished, all this stuff, which of course Shakespeare would never write anything like that. In fact, Macbeth seems a little bit more interested in his own imagination and in the dangers, and the play seems more, I think, more interested in the dangers of the imagination than it is in morality or in Christian morality. So, you had a sort of a misrepresentation of Shakespeare, which was the way that Shakespeare became popular in 1760, and with David Garrick. And also Garrick hated puns and he hated double meanings, interestingly enough. So he cleansed Shakespeare's plays of this kind of this language, which was suspicious and complex and had many resonances. So that's very interesting, I think. And I really think that what we need to do is look at Shakespeare as an aesthete, as a rhetorician, as someone who created other worlds that he thought were more real than reality, and more important, and were perhaps reality in another way. It's hard to talk or think about this because it's another way of looking at the world that's from another era, but
Thank you, Sky Gilbert. We want to remind you, you can get Sky's book right here. Here it is. This is my personal copy. And you can get a copy of his book at Amazon or your other retail book purveyors. We're actually running a little bit ahead of schedule today here on our broadcast schedule. So we're thrilled with that. That can't be said by too many people in a live broadcast format. And we want to thank you for joining us today and for being here with us and spending your Saturday with us, wherever you are around the country or the world. We have had some folks pop up in our YouTube channel chat thread and have expressed to us that we have viewers coming to us from England, from the Netherlands, from Australia. In fact, one of our viewers was kind enough to let us know that all the way deep down under, our sound and video quality was still coming through solid. And we hope that's true where you're at and with your signal. We want to thank you for being sure, those of you who pre-registered, we want to thank you for that. We want to remind you that one of the benefits of having pre-registered is that you will receive an invite to tomorrow's Zoom recap, where members of today's faculty will be Zooming in and you'll be able to have an open forum discussion with them, which will be hosted and moderated by Brian Wildenthal, whose presentation we'll be watching later this afternoon after lunch. Well, now it's actually my turn. I'm going to give you my presentation in just a few moments. And before I do that, I do want to tell you a little bit about my credentials. I'm not a scholar. I've never pretended to be. And it's not my goal to encourage or to persuade the great halls of academia to accept this truth about Shakespeare. as Mark pointed out in his presentation, their blind spots are so deep and dark, I don't think we can ever win that audience over. My goal is to get you to keep thinking, to keep asking questions. And the presentation that I'm about to give hopefully will do that. Hopefully will share you some interesting information, some very interesting coincidences, and cause you to do some more research on your own. So without any further ado, a couple of minutes early, we're going to get into the mentors to genius. Here we go. The Mentors to Genius, presented by me, Stephen Sabel. Benjamin Franklin has been famously quoted as saying, "Genius without education is like silver in the mine." Franklin himself was arguably one of the world's foremost geniuses and a true polymath who excelled in nearly everything he attempted in life. He understood that genius could happen nearly anywhere in any time period, but that without proper training, schooling, and a fostering environment, without access to qualified teachers and mentors, genius would be wasted and go untapped. Where would the world be if Franklin had been born the 10th son of a poor candle maker? Exactly where it is now. Franklin was indeed the 10th son of a poor candle maker, but because Franklin's parents were able to save enough money to provide him an early education at the Boston Latin School, the silver of his genius was able to be mined, and the rest is history. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, baptized as Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart in late January 1756, was not the 10th son of a candle maker. He was not born the son of a butcher, but had he been, he most likely would have been the virtuoso of cuts of meat. Instead, he was born the only son of Leopold Mozart, a master musician and composer in Salzburg, one of the music capitals of the world, at the exact time when music was transforming in ways the world had never seen. Unlike any other composer in musical history, Wolfgang wrote in all the musical genres of his day and excelled in every one. His style, his command of form, and his range of expression have marked him as the most universal composer of all time. Leopold came from an upstanding family which included architects and bookbinders. A year before Wolfgang's birth, his father wrote his Versuch einer gründlichen Violinschule, a most comprehensive treatise on the playing of the violin. It was published the year of Wolfgang's birth and went through two further German editions in 1769 and 1787, as well as being translated into Dutch in 1766 and French in 1770. Recognizing genius early in his son's life, Leopold is recorded as describing the young Wolfgang as the miracle which God let be born in Salzburg. He professed a keen understanding of having a duty to God, as he called it, to share this miracle with the world. And according to the Grove Dictionary of Music, the recognition of this miracle must have struck Leopold with the force of a divine revelation that he felt his responsibility to be not merely a father's and teacher's, but a missionary's as well. In her own letters, Mozart's sister Maria describes her father as having devoted the bulk of his life to her brother's education from that period forward. Wolfgang's early talent for music is unquestionable. At age 3, he was said to be picking out chords on the harpsichord. At age 4, he was already playing short pieces of music. At age 5, he began composing. There are many stories about his precise memory of pitch and his once scribbling a full concerto at 5 years old. Imagine if he had been born the son of an illiterate glove maker. Just before he was 6 years old, Wolfgang's father took him and Maria, who was also highly talented, to Munich to play at the Bavarian court. Soon they performed at the imperial court and noble houses all over Vienna. In 1764, at the age of 8, Leopold brought little Wolfie to London, where he met Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of the great Johann Sebastian Bach. J.C. Bach then spent 5 months teaching Wolfgang in the art of composition. Bach is widely regarded by scholars such as Théodore de Viezvoix and Georges de Saint-Foix as the only true teacher of Mozart. Under J.C. Bach's influence, Wolfgang composed his first symphonies, of which 3 survive today: K16, K19, and K19A, the K signifying the works placed in the catalog of Ludwig von Kochel. 10 years later, in the year 1774, Wolfgang composed more symphonies, concertos for bassoon, and for 2 violins in J.C. Bach style, along with serenades and several sacred works. Indeed, Wolfgang also arranged 3 sonatas from Bach's Opus 5 into keyboard concertos, and in later life, Wolfgang often acknowledged the artistic debt he owed to Johann Christian as his mentor. By age 13, Wolfgang delivered a substantial festal mass before the Austrian court at the dedication of the orphanage church. The following year, 1769, he presented in the Archbishop's Palace in Salzburg. In October of that year, Wolfgang was appointed an honorary concertmeister at the Salzburg court. By now, he had acquired considerable fluency in the musical language of his time, and he became notably adept at replicating the musical equivalent of local dialects from anywhere he visited. In Verona, he was put through the stringent tests at the Accademia Philharmonica, the earliest specifically musical academy of the Renaissance. And in Milan, after tests of his capabilities in dramatic music, he was commissioned to write the first opera for the carnival season. At the request of Leopold Mozart and the recommendation of J.C. Bach, the great music teacher Giovanni Battista Martini, also known as Padre Martini, agreed to take Wolfgang under his wing. Martini was an Italian composer, music theorist, and music historian who was internationally renowned as a teacher. His father was also a violinist and music teacher, something he had in common with the young Wolfie. Among Martini's pupils, the Belgian André Ernest Modeste Grétry, the Bohemian Josef there's a good one for you, Myslivchek, the Ukrainian Maxim Berezovsky, his fellow conventional Franciscan friar Stanislaw Mattei, Johann Christian Bach, and the famous Italian cellist Giovanni Battista Ciri. At age 14, returning through Rome, Wolfgang received a papal audience and was made a Knight of the Order of the Golden Spur. The summer was passed near Bologna, Martini's hometown, where Wolfgang passed the test for admission to the Accademia Philharmonica. In 1772, at the age of 16, Wolfgang worked beneath another mentor, Venanzio Rossini, a famous Italian castrato and music teacher just 10 years Wolfgang's senior, and with whom he worked on the motet Exultate Jubilate. This helped to further shape Wolfgang's ability to compose for singers. In 1777, at the age of 21, Wolfgang spent more than 4 months at Mannheim under the tutelage of Johann Christian Innocens Bonaventura Cannabich, who was then 46 and director of the Mannheim Orchestra, which was described at the time as the most complete and best disciplined in all of Europe. Indeed, Wolfgang praised it as such on numerous occasions. Cannabich was also the son of a music teacher and understood the importance of mentors to the instruction of genius. At the age of 12, he had studied violin under the famous Johann Stamitz when Stamitz was 27. Cannabich's later mentor was opera composer Niccolò Jommelli, before Cannabich went on to study under, guess who? Giovanni Battista Martini. Wolfgang's education had now come full circle and was complete. The silver had been fully mined. Albert Einstein was born March 14, 1879 in Ulm, in what was then in the Kingdom of Württemberg in the German Empire. His father, Hermann, was a salesman and engineer who, along with his brother Jacob, manufactured electrical equipment. Had the Einsteins been a family of grain dealers, where would we be today? Luckily, young Albert was inspired by the machines and mechanical devices he was exposed to at an early age. Albert's uncle Jacob was the first to recognize the boy's brilliance and began to teach him early on at the age of 5, when a compass became Albert's favorite toy. Albert's mother recognized his ability to grasp patterns, and she encouraged his love for music. He played the violin. Something about violin and genius. From age 5 to age 8, he attended a Catholic elementary school. From age 8 to 15, he attended the Luitpold Gymnasium that today has been renamed after him. By age 10, Uncle Jacob had taught young Albert about the Pythagorean theorem. Albert devised his own proof of the theorem, and in doing so gained the attention of family friend Max Talmud, a medical student. Max Talmud, then 20 years old, recognized Albert's genius and began tutoring the 10-year-old boy for the next 6 years. Albert's sister Maja perhaps, wrote in her memoir that Talmud invested his whole person in examining everything that engaged Albert's interest. As Albert's mentor, Talmud gave the then 12-year-old boy a geometry textbook, and after a short time, Talmud noted he had worked through the whole book. He thereupon devoted himself to higher mathematics. Soon, the flight of his mathematical genius was so high, I could not follow. Albert's passion for geometry and algebra led the 12-year-old boy to become convinced that nature could be understood as a mathematical structure, and he started teaching himself calculus. By the age of 14, he said he had mastered integral and differential calculus. At age 13, when he had become more seriously interested in philosophy and music, most especially Mozart's sonatas, Talmud introduced Albert to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Soon, Kant became Albert's favorite philosopher, and Talmud said, at the time he was still a child, only 13 years old, yet Kant's works, incomprehensible to ordinary mortals, seemed to be clear to him. At age 16, Albert was allowed to take the entrance exam for the Polytechnicum of Zurich. He failed the exam, but Albin Herzog, director of the institute, recognized Albert's genius and helped him gain admission to the Cantonal School of Aarau to better prepare him for admission to Zurich the next year. While in Aarau, the 16-year-old Albert became the ward of Jost Winteler, a professor of Greek and history who would become Albert's mentor and new father figure. Winteler's home was known for being a place of many books, music, and post-supper educational discussions. Winteler was also known to read aloud to the members of his household at the dinner table. Albert called him Papa Winteler. It is a relief to know that my son is under such loving care, which is not only concerned with his physical well-being, but also promotes his intellectual and interlife in such a noble fashion. At this young age, the heart is most receptive to a good model, and I am convinced that your good influence will leave a lasting effect, wrote Albert's father Hermann to Winteler in a letter that year. Soon, Albert and Winteler's daughter were romantically involved. Sound familiar? But when Albert called off the relationship, it caused a rift between him and the Winteler family. Still, Winteler remained an ally for Albert, attempting to help him gain employment, serving as a sounding board for advice, and helping to inspire him to become a teacher. Later in life, Albert nostalgically reminisced in a letter to Winteler on those fine, quiet walks near Aarau during which you said so many things to me. While at university in Zurich, Albert lived modestly on a stipend provided to him by his maternal grandparents. He was less than the model student, however, even saying of himself that he lacked the qualities of a good student. He admitted to playing hooky a lot, and only passed his final exams due to the help of his friend and fellow student, Marcel Grossman, who lent Albert his copious notes from lectures Albert failed to attend. Grossman's father would later serve as another mentor to Albert by helping to get him a job in the Swiss patent office. It was Michel Bessot, 6 years Albert's senior, who introduced Albert to the works of Ernst Mach, who would highly influence Albert's work in physics. Albert called Bessot the best-sounding board in Europe for scientific ideas. In Albert's original paper on special relativity, he ended the paper by stating, "In conclusion, let me note that my friend and colleague M. Bessot steadfastly stood by me in my work on the problem here discussed, and that I am indebted to him for many a valuable suggestion." Bessot would also become one of the Academy Olympia, a group of fellow intellectuals Albert would later create, composed of Conrad Heibicht, Maurice Solavine, Lucien Chavan, and Bessot. Sounds a lot like someone else we know. After Professor Heinrich Weber passed the upstart Albert over for an assistant's job and rejected his theories, it was Professor Albert Kleiner who eventually took Albert under his wing and encouraged him to write his dissertation. Kleiner was successful at encouraging Albert to keep his personal theoretical ideas out of the paper. And then Kleiner wrote, "Mr. Einstein, who has become well known on account of several noteworthy papers in the area of mathematical physics, specifically molecular theory, has submitted a dissertation under the title, 'A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions.' The arguments and calculations to be carried out are among the most difficult in hydrodynamics and could be approached only by a person who possesses understanding and training in the treatment of mathematical and physical problems. And it seems to me that Herr Einstein has provided evidence that he is capable of occupying himself successfully with scientific problems. I would therefore recommend that the dissertation be accepted." Subsequently, Kleiner scheduled Albert to deliver a lecture on electrodynamics and relativity before Kleiner then recommended Albert for a newly created professorship in theoretical physics at the University of Zurich. Albert's patent office days were finally over. Albert would later famously say, "Unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth." Edward de Vere was born April 12, 1550, 206 years before Wolfgang Mozart and 329 years before Albert Einstein. Edward's first recorded educator was Sir Thomas Smith, with whom he lived as a young boy. At the ripe old age of 20, Smith was named a professor at Queen's College, Cambridge, where he lectured in natural philosophy and Greek for 7 years before studying abroad in France and Italy. While in Italy, he earned a degree in law from the University of Padua and returned to Cambridge in 1542. In January 1543, he was appointed the first Regius Professor of Civil Law and served as Vice Chancellor of the university the same year. In 1547, he became Provost of Eton College and Dean of Carlisle Cathedral. It can be surmised that Smith may have inspired the young de Vere's longing to someday travel abroad, and Edward's eventual trips through France and Italy. At age 8, Edward indeed followed in Smith's footsteps by entering Queen's College, Cambridge, as an impubis, or prepubescent fellow. Age 8, Queen's College, Cambridge. He later transferred to St. John's College, Cambridge, and Thomas Fowle became his new mentor. Fowle achieved his Master of Arts from Cambridge by the age of 23. By age 28, he was receiving £10 a year to privately tutor the young Edward and helped him matriculate from Queen's College to St. John's. At age 12, after the death of his father, the young Edward became a ward of the Queen and, turn the page, was placed in the home of William Cecil. Records demonstrate that Edward's daily studies under Cecil's tutelage included French, Latin, cosmography, writing, drawing, dancing, and common prayers. While a ward in the Cecil House, the young Edward had access to one of the greatest libraries in all of England. During his first year at Cecil House, Edward was tutored by Lawrence Noel. Noel received his Master of Arts at age 22 and traveled to Paris, Rouen, Antwerp, Louvain, Geneva, Venice, Padua, and Rome just 4 years prior to becoming Edward's new mentor. Noel is best known for transcribing Anglo-Saxon documents and creating the first Anglo-Saxon dictionary. He was also a talented cartographer. During his time as Edward's tutor, Noel came into possession of the only extant copy of Beowulf, bound in what is still known today as the Noel Codex. At the end of his 8 months with the brilliant young Edward, Noel wrote in a letter to Cecil, "I clearly see that my work for the Earl of Oxford cannot be much longer required." The following year, Edward's uncle, Arthur Golding, acknowledged his brilliant nephew's interest in historical events in Golding's dedication of his publication on the histories of Trojas Pompeius, whose father had served under Julius Caesar, and who was known for his 44-volume set of histories dating back to the Macedonian Empire of Philip II. Golding is most famous for his translations of more than 30 Latin works into English, including Julius Caesar's commentaries. But what he is most famous for is his English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses in 1567, when his nephew Edward was 17 years old and already known for his beautiful poetry. Written in rhyming couplets of iambic heptameter, Golding's translation of Ovid is credited as one of the most prominent influences of the works credited to Shakespeare. 3 years earlier, at the age of 14, Edward was awarded a Master of Arts by the University of Cambridge. 2 years later, at the age of 16, while his uncle was deep in the works of Ovid, the young genius was awarded another Master of Arts by the University of Oxford. The following year, Edward entered Gray's Inn to study law at the age of 17. A record of books purchased for Edward 2 years later included his famous Geneva Bible, Chaucer, Plutarch, Cicero, Plato, and other works written in Italian, perhaps even the famous Herodotus volume now in the possession of Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Board of Trustee member Ben August. The same year, Thomas Underdown dedicated his translation of the Ethiopian history of Heliodorus to who? Edward, praising his haughty courage, great skill, and sufficiency of learning. Edward was 19 years old. Underdown's work is praised as the earliest ancestor of the historical novel, credited with influencing numerous Elizabethan dramatists, and most notably the works of Shakespeare. By the end of 1570, when Edward was now 20 years old, he met John Dee, the famous mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, teacher, occultist, and alchemist. Dee served as court astronomer to Queen Elizabeth and had himself acquired one of the largest and most expansive personal libraries in all of England. The education of genius continued. Dee is thought to be one of the real-life inspirations for Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest. In 1571, Edward attained his majority and took his seat in the House of Lords. He soon became the darling of the Elizabethan court. He was known for his brilliant mind, literary and artistic pursuits, poetry, music, dancing, jousting, and more. It was said that he could shake a spear to threaten all challengers in any tournament. And in fact, he received top honors on more than one occasion, even being allowed to participate in one such tournament while he was supposed to be under house arrest for having an affair with one of the Queen's maids of honor. Throughout his 30s, Edward was the patron of many companies of actors, musicians, boy choirs, acrobats, and even performing animals. In 1583, at the age of 33, he purchased a lease for Blackfriars Theatre. Edward was extremely well known for his literary and theatrical patronage. Between 1564, when he was only 14, and 1599, when he was 49, at least 28 works were dedicated to him by their authors, including works by Arthur Golding, John Lilly, Robert Greene, and Anthony Munday. Of his own 33 written dedications, 13 appeared in original or translated works of literature, a higher percentage of literary works than any other patron of similar means. Having been well served by the mentors in his life, Edward sought to mentor others in order to mine their genius. Some examples include, in 1586, Angel Day dedicated The English Secretary, the first epistolary manual for writing model letters in English, to Edward. William Webb praised Edward as most excellent among the rest of our poets in his Discourse of English Poetry. In 1588, Anthony Munday dedicated the two parts of his Palmerin de Oliva. The following year, The Art of English Poesy, attributed to George Putnam, placed Edward among a crew of courtier poets and considered him among the best comic playwrights of the day. In 1590, Edmund Spenser addressed to Edward III of 17 dedicatory sonnets which prefaced the Fairy Queen, celebrating Edward's patronage of poets. 1591, the composer John Farmer dedicated the first set of Diverse and Sundry Ways of Two Parts in One to Edward, noting in the dedication Edward's love of music. These are just a few examples of the testament to Edward's genius. Genius was fostering genius in the very same way genius mentors would later foster the genius of Wolfgang Mozart and Albert Einstein. As Ben Franklin clearly pointed out, these mentors were the miners of the silver in the mine. When we compare these three historical geniuses side by side, Wolfgang, Albert, and Edward, we find the similarities are uncanny. Genius was born, as Leopold Mozart put it so well, the miracle which God let be born. Had these miracles been born into places and times where and when they could not be fostered by great mentors through proper education, their riches would have remained unseen. Had any of these men been born, say, to the household of an illiterate glove maker from a provincial town, we may not have seen Mozart's Requiem, Einstein's theory of relativity, or the works of Shakespeare. But we might have seen a great pair of gloves. As you ponder these comparisons and Franklin's words with which we began this journey into genius, I will leave you with another quote from another genius about the nature of genius. True genius resides in the capacity for evaluation of uncertain, hazardous, and conflicting information. Remember, friends, keep asking questions. And I thank you. I hope that opened your mind to the concepts that the writer of these great works had to have been a genius whose riches and silver had to have been mined by great mentors, like all the other geniuses of the world. Why would it be that this one author, this one genius, didn't require education, didn't require mentors, when we have so much historical proof that that is indeed the key to mining the silver in the mine? Hopefully, today's presentations have opened your mind to the silver in your mine. See what I did there? Opened your mind to the silver in your mine. And hopefully, right now, you're going to mine something good to eat as we break for lunch, because we all need some sustenance here live from Napa. We're glad that you could be joining us wherever you are and whatever time of day. If it isn't lunchtime for you, go have a snack, a cup of coffee, or whatever it will be that you will use to replenish your ability to join us back here in an hour while we continue our live streaming broadcast of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Shakespeare Authorship Symposium. And we'll see you then.